Section 22, Part 1 of Haunted London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ian Stewart, Rosanna, Victoria, Australia. Haunted London by Walter Thornbury, Section 22, Part 1. Chapter 13, St Giles's. That ancient Roman military road, the Watling Street, came from Edgware, and passing over Hyde Park and through James's Park by Old Palace Yard, once the wool staple, it reached the Thames. Thence it was continued to Canterbury and the three great seaports. Another Roman road, the Via Trinobantica, which began at Southampton and ended at Aldborough, ran through London, crossed the Watling Street at Tyburn, and passed along Oxford Street. In latter times, says Dr. Stukely, the road was changed to a more southerly direction, and Holborn was formed, leading to Newgate or the Chamberlain's Gate. One of the earliest tolls ever imposed in England is said to have had its origin in St Giles's. In 1346, Edward III granted to the Master of the Hospital of St Giles and to John de Holborn a commission empowering them to levy tolls for 2 years, 1 penny in the pound on their value, on all cattle and merchandise passing along the public highways leading from the Old Temple, that is Holborn Bars, to the Hospital of St Giles's, and also along the Charing Road and another highway called Portpool, now Gray's Inn Lane. The money was to be used in repairing the roads, which, by the frequent passing of carts, wains, horses, and cattle, had become so miry and deep as to be nearly impassable. The only persons exempted were to be lords, ladies, and persons belonging to religious establishments. Henry V ascended the throne in 1413, and astonished his subjects by suddenly casting off his slough of vice and becoming a self-restrained, virtuous, and high-spirited king. His first care was to forget party distinctions, and to put down the Lollards, or disciples of Wycliffe, whom the clergy denounced as dangerous to the civil power. As a good general secures the rear of his army before he advances, so the young king was probably desirous to guard himself against this growing danger before he invaded Normandy and made a clutch at the French crown. Arundel, the primate, urged him to indict Sir John Oldcastle, Lord Cobham, the head of the Lollard sect. The king was averse to a prosecution, and suggested milder means. At a conference, therefore, appointed before the bishops and doctors in 1414, the following articles were handed Oldcastle as tests, and the unorthodox lord was allowed 2 days to retract his heresies. He was required to confess that at the sacrament the material bread and wine are turned into Christ's very body and Christ's very blood, that every Christian man ought to confess to an ordained priest, that Christ ordained St. Peter and his successors as his vicars on earth, that Christian men ought to obey the priest, and that it is profitable to go on pilgrimages and to worship the relics and images of saints. This is determination of Holy Church. How feel ye this article? With these stern words ended every dogma proposed by the primate. Lord Cobham, who was much esteemed by the king and had been a good soldier under his father, repeatedly refused to profess his belief in these tenets. The archbishop then delivered the heretic to the secular arm, to be put to death according to the usage of the times. The night previous to his execution, however, Lord Cobham escaped from the Tower and fled to Wales, where he lay hid for 4 years while Agincourt was being fought, and where he must have longed to have been present with his true sword. Soon after his escape, the frightened clergy spread a report that he was in St Giles's Fields at the head of 20,000 Lollards, who were resolved to seize the king and his 2 brothers, the Dukes of Bedford and Gloucester. For this imaginary plot, 36 persons were hanged or burnt, but the names of only 3 are recorded, and of these Sir Roger Acton is the only person of distinction. A reward of 1,000 marks was offered for Lord Cobham, and other inducements were held out by Chichley, the primate Arundel's successor. 4 years, however, elapsed before the premature Protestant was discovered and taken by Lord Powis in Wales. After some blows and blood, a countrywoman in the fray breaking Cobham's leg with a stool, he was secured and sent up to London in a horse litter. He was sentenced to be drawn on a hurdle to the gallows in St. Giles's Fields, and to be hanged over a fire in order to inflict on him the utmost pain. He was brought from the Tower on the 25th of December 1418, and his arms bound behind him. He kept a very cheerful countenance as he was drawn to the field where his assumed treason had been committed. When he reached the gallows, he fell devoutly on his knees and piously prayed God to forgive his enemies. The cruel preparations for his torment struck no terror in him, nor shook the constancy of the martyr. He bore everything bravely as a soldier, and with the resignation of a Christian. Then he was hung by the middle with chains and consumed alive in the fire, praising God's name as long as his life lasted. He was accused by his enemies of holding that there was no such thing as free will, that all sin was inevitable, and that God could not have prevented Adam's sin, nor have pardoned it without a satisfaction of Christ. Fuller says of him, "Stage poets have themselves been very bold with, and others very merry at, the memory of Sir John Oldcastle, Lord Cobham, whom they have fancied a boon companion or jovial roisterer, and yet a coward to boot, contrary to the credit of the chronicles, owning him to be a martial man of merit. Sir John Falstaff hath derided the memory of Sir John Oldcastle, and of late is substituted buffoon in his place. But it matters us little what petulant priests or what malicious poets have written against him." The gallows had been removed from the elms at Smithfield in 1413, the first year of Henry V, but Tyburn was a place of execution as early as 1388. The St. Giles's gallows was set up at the north corner of the hospital wall, between the termination of High Street and Crown Street, opposite to where the Pound stood. The manor of St. Giles was anciently divided from Bloomsbury by a great fosse called Blemen's Ditch. The Domesday Book contains no mention of this district, nor indeed of London at all, except of 10 acres of land nigh Bishopsgate, belonging to St. Paul's, and a vineyard in Holborn, belonging to the Crown. This yard is supposed to have stood on the site of the Vine Tavern, now destroyed, a little to the east of Kingsgate Street. Blemen's Ditch was a line of defence running nearly parallel with the north side of Holborn, and connecting itself to the east with the Fleet Brook. It was probably of British origin. On the north-west of London, in the Roman times, there were marshes and forests, and even as late as Elizabeth, Marylebone and St. John's Wood were almost all chase. The manor was crown property in the Norman times, for Matilda, daughter of Malcolm, King of Scotland, and the Queen of Henry I, built a leper hospital there and dedicated it to St. Giles. The same good woman erected a hospital at Cripplegate, and another at St. Catherine's, near the Tower, and founded a priory within Aldgate. The hospital of St. Giles sheltered 40 lepers, 1 clerk, a messenger, the master, and several matrons. The Queen gave 60 shillings each a year to each leper. The inmates of later hospitals were in the habit of begging in the marketplaces. The patron saint, St. Giles, was an Athenian of the 7th century who lived as a hermit in a forest near Nismes. One day some hunters, pursuing a hind that he had tamed, struck the Greek with an arrow as he protected it, but the good man still went on praying and refused all recompense for the injury. The French king in vain attempted to entice the saint from his cell, which in time, however, grew first into a monastery and then into a town. The hospital was built on the site of the old parish church, and it occupied 8 acres. It stood a little to the west of the present church, where Lloyd's Court stands, or stood, and its gardens reached between High Street and Hog Lane, now Crown Street, to the Pound, which used to stand nearly opposite to the west end of Meuse Brewhouse. It was surrounded by a triangular wall, running in a line with Crown Street to somewhere near the Cock and Pie Fields, afterwards the 7 Dials, in a line with Monmouth Street, and thence east and west up High Street, joining near the Pound. Unwholesome diet and the absence of linen seems to have encouraged leprosy, which was probably a disease of Eastern origin. In 1179 the Lateran Council decreed that lepers should keep apart, and have churches and churchyards of their own. It was therefore natural to build hospitals for lepers outside large towns. Henry II, for the health of the souls of his grandfather and grandmother, granted the poor lepers a second 60 shillings, each to be paid yearly at the feast of St. Michael, and 30 shillings more out of his Surrey rents to buy them lights. He also confirmed to them the grant of a church at Feltham, near Hounslow. In Henry III's reign, Pope Alexander IV issued a bull to confirm these privileges. Edward I granted the hospital 2 charters in 1300 and 1303, and in Edward II's reign so many estates were granted to it that it became very rich. Edward III made St Giles a cell of Burton St Lazar in Leicestershire. This annexation led to quarrels and to armed resistance against the visitations of Robert, Archbishop of Canterbury. In this reign the Great Plague broke out, and the king commanded the wards of the city to issue proclamations and remove all lepers. It is strange that St Giles should have been the resort of pariahs from the very beginning. Burton St Lazar, a manor sold in 1828 for £30,000, is still celebrated for its cheeses. It remained a flourishing hospital from the reign of Stephen till Henry VIII suppressed it. St Giles's sank in importance after this absorption and finally fell in 1537 with its larger brother. By a deed of exchange, the greedy king obtained 48 acres of land, some marshes and 2 inns. 6 years after, the king gave St Giles to John Dudley, Viscount Lisle, High Admiral of England, who fitted up the principal part of the hospital for his own residence. 2 years after, Lord Lisle sold the manor to Wymond Carew, Esquire. The mansion was situated westward of the church and facing it. It was afterwards occupied by the celebrated Alice, Duchess of Dudley, who died there in the reign of Charles II, aged 90. This house was subsequently the residence of Lord Wharton. It divided Lloyd's Court from Denmark Street. The Master's House, the White House, stood on the site of Dudley Court, and was given by the Duchess to the parish as a rectory house. The wall which surrounded the hospital gardens and orchards was not entirely removed till 1639. Early in the 14th century, the parish of St Giles, including the hospital inmates, numbered only 100 inhabitants. In King John's reign it was laid out in garden plots and cottages. In Henry III's reign it was a scattered country village, with a few shops and Stone Cross, where the High Street now is. As far back as 1225 a blacksmith's shop stood at the north-west end of Drury Lane and remained there till its removal in 1575. In Queen Elizabeth's reign the Holborn houses did not run farther than Red Lion Street. The road was then open as far as the present Hart Street, where a garden wall commenced near Broad Street, St Giles's, and the end of Drury Lane, where a cluster of houses on the right formed the chief part of the village, the rest being scattered houses. The hospital precincts were at this time surrounded by trees. Beyond this, north and south, all was country, and avenues of trees marked out the Oxford and other roads. There was no house from Broad Street, St Giles's, to Drury House at the top of Wych Street. The lower part of Holborn was paved in the reign of Henry VI, in 1417, and in 1542. It was completed as far as St Giles's, being very full of pits and sloughs, and perilous and noisome to all on foot or horseback. The first increase of buildings in this district was on the north side of Broad Street. 3 edicts of 1582, 1593, and 1602 evince the alarm of government at the increase of inhabitants, and prohibit further building under severe penalties. The first proclamation, dated from Nonsuch Palace in Surrey, assigns the reason of these prohibitions. 1. The difficulty of governing more people without new officers and fresh jurisdictions. 2. The difficulty of supplying them with food and fuel at reasonable rates. 3. The danger of plague and the injury to agriculture. Regulations were also issued to prevent the further resort of country people to town, and the Lord Mayor took oaths to enforce these proclamations. But London burst through these foolish and petty restraints as Samson burst the green withes. In 1580 the resident foreigners in the capital had increased from 3,762 to 6,462 persons, the majority being Dutch who had fled from the Spaniards, and Huguenots who had escaped from France after the massacre of St Bartholomew. St Giles's grew, especially to the east and west round the hospital. The girdle wall was mostly demolished soon after 1595. Holborn, stretching westward with its fair houses, lodgings for gentlemen, and inns for travellers, had nearly reached it. In Aggas's map, cattle graze and intersecting footpaths where the great Queen Street now is. There were then only 2 or 3 houses in Covent Garden, but in 1606 the east side of Drury Lane was built. In the assessment of 1623 upwards of 20 courtyards and alleys are mentioned, and 100 houses were added on the north side of St Giles's Street, 136 in Bloomsbury, 56 on the west side of Drury Lane, and 71 on the south side of Holborn. The south and east sides of the hospital site had been the slowest in their growth. After the Great Fire these still remained gardens, but the north side, nearer Oxford Road, was already occupied. The first inhabitants of importance were Mr. Abram Speckart and Mr. Breads, in the reigns of James I and Charles I, and afterwards Sir William Stidolph. New Compton Street was originally called Stidolph Street, but afterwards changed its name when Charles II gave the adjoining marshland to Mr. Francis Compton, who built on the old hospital land a continuation of Old Compton Street. Monmouth Street, probably named after the foolish and unfortunate Duke, was also built in this reign. In 1694, in the reign of William III, a Mr. Neal, a lottery promoter, took on lease the Cock and Pie Fields, then the resort of gambling boys, thieves and beggars, and a sink of filth and cesspools, and built the neighbouring streets, placing in the centre a Doric pillar with 7 dials on it. Afterwards a clock was added. This same Sir Thomas Neal took a large piece of ground on the north side of Piccadilly from Sir Thomas Clarges, agreeing to lay out £10,000 in building, but he failed to carry out his design, and Sir Walter Clarges, after great trouble, got the lease out of his hands, and Clarges Street was then built. In 1697, many hundreds of the 14,000 French refugees who fled from Louis XIV's dragoons after the cruel revocation of the Edict of Nantes settled about Long Acre, the 7 Dials, and Soho. In Strype's time, Queen Anne's reign, Stakel Street, Kendrick Yard, Vinegar Yard, and Phoenix Street were mostly occupied by poor French people, indigent marquises, and starving countesses. In the reign of Queen Anne, St Giles's increased with great rapidity. St Giles's Street and Broad Street from the Pound to Drury Lane, the south-east side of Tottenham Court Road, Crown Street, the 7 Dials, and Castle Street were completed. The south side of Holborn was also finished from Broad Street to a little east of Great Turnstile, and on the north side the street spread to 2 doors east of the Vine Tavern. The Irish had already begun to debase St Giles's. The French refugees completed the degradation and hopelessness and spread like a mud deluge towards Soho. In 1640 there are in the parish book several entries of money paid to soldiers and distressed men who had lost everything they had in Ireland. Paid to a poor Irishman and to a prisoner come over from Dunkirk, 1 shilling. Paid for a shroud for an Irishman that died at Brickett's, 2 shillings and 6pence. In 1640, 1642 and 1647 there constantly occurred donations to poor Irish ministers and plundered Irish. Clothes were sent by the parish into Ireland. There is 1 entry. Paid to a poor gentleman undone by the burning of a city in Ireland, having licence from the Lords to collect, 3 shillings. The following entries are also curious and characteristic. 1642. To Mrs. Mabb, a poet's wife, her husband being dead, 1 shilling. Paid to Goody Parish to buy her boys 2 shirts, and Charles their father, a waterman at Chiswick, to keep him at £20 a year from Christmas, 3 shillings. 1648. Gave to the Lady Pygott, in Lincoln's Inn Fields, poor and deserving relief, 2 shillings and 6pence. 1670. Given to the Lady Thornbury, being poor and indigent, 10 shillings. 1641. To Old Goodman Street and Old Goody Malthus, very poor. 1645. To Mother Cole and Mother Johnson, 20p apiece, 2 shillings. 1646. To William Burnett, in a cellar in Raggedstaff Yard, being poor and very sick, 1 shillings and 6pence. To Goody Sherlock, in Maidenhead Fields Lane, 1 linen wheel, and gave her money to buy flax, 1 shilling. There are also some interesting entries showing what a sink for the poverty of all the world the St Giles's cellars had become, even before the Restoration. 1640. Gave to Signor Lifcatha, a distressed Grecian. 1642. To Laelish Milchitaire of Jamaica, in Armenia, to pass him to his own country and to redeem his sons in slavery under the Turks, 5 shillings. 1654. Paid towards the relief of the mariners, maimed soldiers, widows and orphans of such as have died in the service of Parliament, £4 11 shillings. These were for Cromwell's soldiers. and this year Oliver himself gave £40 to the parish to buy coals for the poor. 1666. Collected at several times towards the relief of the poor sufferers burnt out by the late dreadful fire of London, £25, 8 shillings and 4pence. In 1670, nearly £185 was collected in this parish towards the redemption of slaves. After 1648, the Irish are seldom mentioned by name. They had grown by this time part and parcel of the district, and dragged all round them down to poverty. In 1653, an assistant beadle was appointed especially to search out and report all new arrivals of chargeable persons. In 1659, a monthly vestry meeting was instituted to receive the constable's report as to new vagrants. In 1675, French refugees began to increase, and in 1679 to 1680, 1690 and 1692, fresh efforts were made to search out and investigate the cases of all newcomers. In 1710, the church wardens reported to the commissioners for building new churches that a great number of French Protestants were inhabitants of the parish. Well-known beggars of the day are frequently mentioned in the parish accounts, as for instance, 1640 gave to Tottenham Court Meg, being very sick, 1 shilling. 1642 gave to the ballad-singing cobbler, 1 shilling. 1646 gave to old Friswig, £1 6 shillings. 1657 paid the collectors for a shroud for old Guy, the poet, 2 shillings and 6pence. 1658 paid a year's rent for Mad Bess, £1 4 shillings and 6pence. 1642 paid to one Thomas, a traveller, 6pence. To a poor woman and her children almost starved, 5 shillings and 6pence. 1645 for a shroud for Hunter's child, the blind beggar man, 1 shilling and 6pence. 1646 paid and given to a poor wretch name forgot, 1 shilling. Given to old Osborne, a troublesome fellow, 1 shilling and 3pence. Paid to Roton, the lame glazier, to carry him towards Bath, 3 shillings. 1647 to old Osborne and his blind wife, 6pence. To the old mud wall maker, 6pence. In 1665 the plague fell heavily on St. Giles's, already dirty and overcrowded. The pest had already broken out 5 times within the 80 years beginning in 1592, but no outbreak of this oriental pest in London had carried off more than 36,000 persons. The disease in 1665, however, slew no fewer than 97,306 in 10 months. In St. Giles's, the plague of 1592 carried off 894 persons. In 1625 there died of the plague about 1,333, but in 1665 there were swept off from this parish alone 3,216. The plague of 1625 seemed to have alarmed London quite as much as its successor, for we find that in St. Giles's no assessment could be made, as the richer people had all fled into the country. A pest house was fitted up in Bloomsbury for the 9 adjoining parishes, and this was afterwards taken by St. Giles's for itself. The vestry appointed 2 examiners to inspect infected houses. Mr. Pratt, the churchwarden, who advanced money to succour the poor when the rich deserted them, was afterwards paid £40 for the sums he had generously disbursed at his own risk. In 1642 the entries in the parish books showed that the disease had again become virulent and threatening. The bodies were collected in carts by torchlight and thrown without burial service into large pits. Infected houses were padlocked up, and watchmen placed to admit doctors or persons bringing food to the searchers, who at night brought out the dead. The following entries, for 1642, in the parish books seem to me even more terrible than Defoe's romance written 50 years after the events. Paid for the 2 padlocks and hasps for visited houses, 2 shillings and 6pence. Paid Mr. Hyde for candles for the bearers, 10 shillings. To the same for the night cart and cover, £7 9 shillings. To Mr. Mann for links and candles for the night bearers, 10 shillings. The next year the plague still raged, and the same precaution seemed to have been taken as afterwards in 1665, showing that the terrible details of that punishment of filth and neglect were not new to London citizens. The entries go on. To the bearers for carrying out of Crown Street a woman that died of the plague, 1 shilling and 6pence. Sent to a poor man shut up in Crown Yard of the plague, 1 shilling and 6pence. Then follow some sums paid for padlocks and staples, graves and links. Paid and given Mr. Lynn the beadle for a piece of good service to the parish in conveying away of a visited household to Lord's Pest House, 4th of Mr. Higgins's house at Bloomsbury, 1 shilling and 6pence, received of Mr. Hurl, Dr. Temple's gift, to be given to Mrs. Hockey, a minister's widow, shut up in the creche yard of the plague, 10 shillings. But now came the awful pestilence of 1665. The streets were so deserted that grass grew in them, and nothing was to be seen but coffins, pest carts, link men, and red-crossed doors. The air resounded with the tolling of bells, the screams of distracted mourners crying from the windows, "Pray for us," and the dismal call of the searchers, "Bring out your dead." The plague broke out in its most malignant form among the poor of St. Giles's, and Dr. Hodges and Sir Richard Massingham, both first-rate authorities on this subject, agree in this assertion. In August 1665 an additional rate to the amount of £600 was levied. Independent of this, very large sums were subscribed by persons resident in or interested in the parish. The following are a few of the items. Mr. Williams, from the Earl of Clare, £10. Mr. Justice Sir Edmundbury Godfrey, from the Lord Treasurer, £50. Earl Craven and the rest of the justices, towards the visited poor at various times, £449 16 shillings and 10pence. Earl Craven towards the visited poor, £40 3 shillings. There are also these ominous entries. August, paid the searchers for viewing the corpse of Goodwife Phillips, who died of the plague, 6pence. Laid out for Goodman Phillips and his children being shut up and visited, 5 shillings. Laid out for Lila Lewis, 3 Crane Court, being shut up of the plague, and laid out for the nurse, and for the nurse and burial, 18 shillings and 6pence. In July 1666 the constables, etc., were ordered to make an account of all new inmates coming to the parish, and to take security that they would not become burdensome. They were also directed to be careful to prevent the infection spreading for the future by a timely guard of all that are or hereafter may happen to be visited. During the plague time, says an eyewitness, nobody put on black or formal mourning, yet London was all in tears. The shrieks of women and children at the doors and windows of their houses, where their dearest relations were dying or perhaps dead, were enough to pierce the stoutest hearts. At the west end of the town it was a surprising thing to see those streets which were usually thronged now grown desolate, so that I have sometimes gone the length of a whole street, I mean by-streets, and have seen nobody to direct me but watchmen, sitting at the doors of such houses as were shut up. And one day I particularly observed that even in Holborn the people walked in the middle of the street, and not at the sides, not to mingle, as I supposed, with anybody that came out of infected houses, or met with smells and scents from them. Dr. Hodges, a great physician who shunned no danger, describes even more vividly the horrors of that period. In the streets, he says, might be seen persons seized with the sickness, staggering like drunken men. Here lay some dozing and almost dead. There others were met fatigued with excessive vomiting, as if they had drunk poison. In the midst of the market, persons in full health fell suddenly down as if the contagion was there exposed to sale. It was not uncommon to see an inheritance pass to the 3 heirs within the space of 4 days. The bearers were not sufficient to inter the dead. It is supposed that till the leper hospital was suppressed, the St. Giles's people used the oratory there as their parish church. Leyland does not mention any other church, although he lived and wrote about the time of the suppression, and even made an effort to save the monastic manuscripts by proposing to have them placed in the King's Library. The oratory had probably a screen walling off the lepers from the rest of the congregation. It boasted several chantry chapels and a high altar at the east end dedicated to St. Giles, before which burnt a great taper called St. Giles's Light, and towards which, about A.D. 1200, one William Christmas bequeathed an annual sum of 12pence. There was also a chapel of St. Michael appropriated to the infirm, and which had its own special priest. End of Section 22, Part 1. Recording by Ian Stewart, Rosanna, Victoria, Australia. Section 23 of Haunted London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ian Stewart, Rosanna, Victoria, Australia. Haunted London by Walter Thornbury, Section 23. In the reign of Charles I, the south side of the hospital church was full of rubbish, lumber and coffin boards, and Lady Dudley put up a screen to divide the nave from the chancel. In 1623 the church became so ruinous that it had to be rebuilt at an expense of £2,068 7 shillings and twopence. Among the subscribers appear the names of the Duchess of Lennox, Sir Anthony Ashley, Sir John Cotton, and the players at the Cockpit Playhouse. The 415 householders of the parish subscribed £1,065 9 shillings. The donations ranging from the £250 of the Duchess of Dudley to Mother Parker's twopence. Nearly 5 years elapsed before the new church was consecrated. On the 9th of June 1628, Pym brought a charge against the rector, Dr. Mannering, for having preached 2 obnoxious sermons entitled Religion and Allegiance, and accused the imprudent time-server of persuading citizens to obey illegal commands on pain of damnation, and framing, like Guy Fawkes, a mischievous plot to alter and subvert the government. The third sermon, in which Mannering defended his 2 first, the stern Commons found, upon inquiry, had been printed by special command of the King. It was as full of mischief as a bombshell. It held that on any exigency all property was transferred to the sovereign, that the consent of Parliament was not necessary for the imposition of taxes, and that the divine laws required compliance with every demand which a prince should make upon his subjects. For these doctrines the Commons impeached Mannering. The sentence pronounced on him was that he should be imprisoned during the pleasure of the House, that he should be fined £1,000 to the King, make submission of his offence, be suspended from lay and ecclesiastical office for 3 years, and that his sermons be called in and burnt. On June 20 the courtly preacher came to the House, and on his knees submitted himself in sorrow and repentance for the errors and indiscretions he had been guilty of in preaching the sermons rashly, scandalously, and unadvisedly. He further acknowledged the 3 sermons to be full of dangerous passages and aspersions, and craved pardon for them of God and the King. No sooner was the session over than the wilful King pardoned him, promoted him to the deanery of Winchester, and some years after to the bishopric of St. David's. The new church was consecrated on the 26th of January 1630. Bishop Laud performed the ceremony and was entertained at the house of a Mr. Speckart near the church. There were 2 tables sufficient to seat 32 persons. The broken churchyard wall was fenced up with boards, the altar hung with green velvet, a rail made to keep the mob from the west door, and a train of constables armed with bills and halberts appointed to maintain order if the Puritans became threatening. The new rector, Dr. Hayward, had been chaplain to Laud, and was probably of the High Church party. Like his exiled predecessor, he had been chaplain to one of the most arbitrary of kings. In 1640 the Puritans, gaining strength, petitioned Parliament against him, stating that he had set up crucifixes and images of saints, likewise organs, with other confused music, etc., hindering devotion and maintained at the great and needless charge of the parish. They described the carved screen as particularly obnoxious, and they objected to the altar rail, the chancel carpet, the purple velvet in the desk, the needlework covers of the books, the tapestry, the lawn cloth, the bone lace of the altar cloths, and the taffeta curtains on the walls. These popish and superstitious ornaments were sold by order of Parliament, all but the plate and the great bell. The surplices were given away, the 12 apostles were washed off the organ loft, and the painted glass was taken down from the windows. The screen was sold for 40 shillings, and the money given to the poor. The covenant was framed and hung up in the church, and 5 shillings given to a pewterer for a new basin cut square on one side for baptisms. The blue velvet carpet, embroidered cushions, and blue curtains were sold, and so were the communion rails. In 1647 Lady Dudley's pew was lined with green baize and supplied with 2 straw mats. In 1650 the King's arms were taken out of the windows, and a sundial was substituted. The organ loft was let as a pew. The Restoration soon followed on these paltry excesses of a low-bred fanaticism. The ringers of St Giles's rang a peal for 3 days running. The King's Arms in the vestry and the windows were restored. Galleries were erected for the nobility. In 1670 a brass chandelier of 16 branches was bought for the church and an hourglass for the pulpit. In 1718 the old hospital church had become damp and unwholesome. The grave ground had risen 8 feet, so that the church lay in a pit. Parliament was therefore petitioned that St Giles's should be one of the 50 new churches. It was urged that a good church facing the High Street, the chief thoroughfare for all persons who travel the Oxford or Hampstead roads, would be a great ornament. The petitioners also contended that St Giles's already spent £5,300 a year on the poor, and that a new rate would impoverish many industrious persons. The Duke of Newcastle, the Lord Chancellor, and other eminent parishioners strenuously supported the petition, which, on the other hand, was warmly opposed by the Archbishop of York, 5 bishops, and 11 temporal peers. The opposition contended that the parish was well able to repair the present church, that the fund given for building new churches was never meant to be devoted to rebuilding old ones, and that so far from the parish not requiring church accommodation, St Giles's contained 40,000 persons, a number for which 3 new churches would be barely sufficient. 11 years longer the church remained a ruin, when in 1729 the commissioners granted £8,000 for a new church, provided that the parish would settle £350 a year on the rector of the new parish of Bloomsbury. The architect of the new church, opened in 1734, was Henry Flitcroft. The roof is supported by Ionic pillars of Portland stone. The steeple is 160 feet high and consists of a rustic pedestal supporting Doric pilasters. Over the clock is an octangular tower with 3/4 Ionic columns supporting a balustrade with vases. The spire is octangular and belled. This hideous production of Greek rules was much praised by the critics of 1736. They called it simple and elegant. They considered the East End as pleasing and majestic, and found nothing in the West to object to but the smallness and poverty of the doors. The steeple they described as light, airy, and genteel, whether taken with the body of the church or considered as a separate building. In 1827 the clock of St Giles's Church was illuminated with gas, and the novelty and utility of the plan attracted crowds to visit it from the remotest parts of the metropolis. St Giles's churchyard was enlarged in 1628 and again soon after the Restoration. The garden plot from which the new part was divided was called Brown's Gardens. In 1670 we find the sexton agreeing, on condition of certain windows he had been allowed to introduce into the site of his house facing the churchyard, to furnish the rector and churchwardens every Tuesday se'nnight after Easter with 2 fat capons ready dressed. In 1687 the Resurrection Gate, or Lich Gate as it was called, and which still exists, was erected at a cost of £185 14 shillings and 6pence. It stood for many years farther to the west than the old gate, and contains a heap of dully carved figures in relievo, abridged from Michelangelo's Last Judgment, and crowded under a large compass pediment. It has lately, however, been replaced in its old position. This work was much admired and celebrated, but Nollican Smith says that it is poor stuff. Pennant, always shrewd and vivacious, was one of the first writers who exposed the disgraceful and dangerous condition of the London churchyards. He describes seeing at St Giles as a great square pit with rows of coffins piled one upon the other, exposed to sight and smell, awaiting the mortality of the night. I turned away, he says, disgusted at the scene, and scandalised at the want of police, which so little regards the health of the living as to permit so many putrid corpses packed between some slight boards, dispersing their dangerous effluvia over the capital. In 1808 a new burial ground for St Giles's parish was consecrated in St Pancras's. It stands in grim loneliness between the Hampstead Road and College Street, Camden Town. The graves of John Flaxman, the sculptor, and his wife and sister are marked by an altar tomb of brick, surmounted by a thick slab of Portland stone. Near it is the ruinous tomb of ingenious, faddling Sir John Soane, the architect of the Bank of England. It is a work of great pretension, but cut up into toy-shop prettiness with all the peculiar defects of his style and manner. 2 black cypresses mark the grave. A few eminent persons are buried in the old St Giles's churchyard. Amongst these, the most illustrious is George Chapman, who produced a fine though rugged translation of the Iliad, which is to Pope's What Heart of Oak is to Veneer, and who died in 1634, aged 77, and lies buried here. Inigo Jones generously erected an altar tomb to his memory at his own expense. It is still to be seen in the external southern wall of the church. The monument is old, but the inscription is only a copy of all that remained visible of the old writing. That chivalrous visionary, Lord Herbert of Cherbury, was also buried here, and so was James Shirley, the dramatist, who died in 1666. The latter was the last of the great anti-restoration playwriters, and of a thinner fibre than any of the rest, except melancholy Ford. Richard Pendrell, the Staffordshire farmer, the preserver and conductor of King Giles II after his escape from Worcester fight, has an altar tomb to his memory raised in this churchyard. After the Restoration, Richard came to town, to be in the way, I suppose, of the good things then falling into Cavaliers' mouths, and probably settled in St Giles's to be near the court. The story of the Boscobel Oak was one with which the swarthy king delighted to buttonhole his courtiers. Pendrell died in 1671, and had a monument erected to his memory on the south-east side of the church. The black marble slab of the old tomb forms the base of the present one. The epitaph is in a strain of fulsome bombast, considering the king who was preserved showed his gratitude to heaven only by a long career of unblushing vice, and by impoverishing and disgracing the foolish country that called him home. It begins thus: "Hold, passenger, here's shrouded in this hearse unparalleled Pendrell through the universe. Like when the eastern star from heaven gave light to 3 lost kings, so he in such dark night to Britain's monarch, lost by adverse war, on earth appeared a second eastern star." The dismal poet ends by assuring the world that Pendrell, the king's pilot, had gone to heaven to be rewarded for his good steering. In 1702 a Pendrell was overseer in this parish. About 1827 a granddaughter of this Richard lived near Covent Garden, and still enjoyed part of the family pension. In 1827 Mr John Pendrell, another descendant of Richard, died at Eastbourne. His son kept an inn at Lewes, and was afterwards clerk at a Brighton hotel. The only monument at present of interest in the church is a recumbent figure of the Duchess Dudley, the great benefactor of the parish, created a duchess in her own right by Charles I. She died 1669. The monument was preserved by parochial gratitude when the church was rebuilt in consideration of the Duchess's numerous bequests to the parish. She was buried at Stoneleigh in Warwickshire. This pious and charitable lady was the daughter of Sir Thomas Lee of Stoneleigh, and she married Sir Robert Dudley, son of the great Earl of Leicester, who deserted her and his 5 daughters and went and settled in Florence, where he became Chamberlain to the Grand Duchess. Clever and unprincipled as his father, Sir Robert devised plans for draining the country around Pisa and improving the port of Leghorn. He was outlawed, and his estates at Kenilworth, etc., were confiscated and sold for a small sum to Prince Henry. But Charles I generously gave them back to the Duchess. In her funeral sermon, Dr. Borman says of this good woman, "She was a magazine of experience. I have often said she was a living chronicle bound up with the thread of a long-spun age, and in divers incidents and things relating to our parish I have often appealed to her stupendous memory as to an ancient record. In short, I would say to any desirous to attain some degree of perfection, Vade ad sancti aegidii oppidum et disque ducinam Dudliam. Come to St Giles's and inquire the character of Lady Dudley." The oldest monument remaining in the churchyard in 1708 was dated 1611. It was a tombstone, close to the wall on the south side and near the west end, and was to the memory of a Mrs Thornton. Her husband was the builder of Thornton Alley, which was probably his estate. The following painful lines were round the margin of the stone: "Full south this stone 4 foot doth lie, his father John and grandsire Henry Thornton, of Thornton, in Yorkshire bred, where lives the fame of Thorntons being dead." Against the east end of the north aisle of the church was the tombstone of Eleanor Stewart, who died 1725, aged 123 years and 5 months. That good and inflexible patriot, Andrew Marvell, the most poignant satirist of King Charles II, died in 1678 and is buried in St Giles's. Marvell was Latin secretary to Milton, and in the school of that good man's house learned how a true patriot should live. It is recorded that one day when he was dining in Maiden Lane, one of Charles II's courtiers came to offer him £1,000 as a bribe for his silence. Marvell refused the gift, took off the dish cover, and showed his visitor the humble half-picked mutton bone on which he was about to dine. He was member for Kingston upon Hull for nearly 20 years, and was buried at last at the expense of his constituents. They also voted a sum of money to erect a monument to him, with a harmless epitaph. To this, however, the rector of the time, to his own disgrace, refused admittance. Thomson, the editor of Marvell's works, searched in vain in 1774 for the patriot's coffin. He could find no plate earlier than 1722. In the same church with this fixed star rests that comet, Sir Roger L'Estrange. His monument was said to be the grandest in the church. Sir Roger died in 1704, aged 88. In 1721, after an ineffectual treaty for Dudley Court, where the parsonage house had once stood, a piece of ground called Vinegar Yard was purchased for the sum of £2,252 10s as a burial ground, hospital, and workhouse for the parish of St Giles's. At that time, St Giles's relieved about 840 persons at the cost of £4,000 a year. Of this number there were 162 over 70 years of age, 126 parents overburthened with children, 183 deserted children and orphans, 70 sick at parish nurses, and 300 men lame, blind, and mad. The Earl of Southampton granted land for 5 almshouses in St Giles's in 1656. The site was in Broad Street, nearly at the north end of Monmouth and King Streets, where they stood until 1782, at which period they were pulled down to widen the road. The new almshouses were erected in a close, low, and unhealthy spot in Lukenaw's Lane. In the year 1661, Mr. William Shelton left lands for a school of 50 children in Parker's Lane, between Drury Lane and Little Queen Street. The tenements, before he bought them, had been in the occupation of the Dutch ambassador. The premises were poor houses and a coach house and stables in the occupation of Lord Halifax. In 1687, the funds proving inadequate, the school was discontinued, but in 1815, after being in abeyance for 53 years, it was reopened in Lloyd's Court. The select vestry of St Giles's was much badgered in 1828 by the excluded parishioners. There were endless errors in the accounts, and items amounting to £90,000 were found entered only in pencil. The special pleas put in by the attorneys of the vestry covered 175 folios of writing. Hog Lane, built in 1680, was rechristened in 1762 Crown Street, as an inscription on a stone let into the wall of a house at the corner of Rose Street intimates. Strype calls it a place not over well built or inhabited. The Greeks had a church here, afterwards a French refugee place of worship, and subsequently an independent chapel. It stood on the west side of the lane, a few doors from Compton Street, and its site is now occupied by St Mary's Church and Clergy House. Hogarth laid the scene of his noon in Hog Lane at the door of this chapel, but the houses being reversed in the engraving, the truth of the picture is destroyed. The background contains a view of St Giles's Church. The painter delighted in ridiculing the fantastic airs of the poor French gentry, and showed no kindly sympathy with their honest poverty and their sufferings. It was to St Giles's that Hogarth came to study poverty and also vice. A scene of his harlot's progress is in Drury Lane close by. Tom Nero, in the 4 Stages of Cruelty, is a St Giles's charity boy, and we see him in the first stage tormenting a dog near the church. Hogarth's Gin Street is situated at St Giles's. The scenes of all the most hideous and painful of his works are in this district. Nollekens Smith, writing of St Giles's, says, "I recollect the building of most of the houses at the north end of New Compton Street, so named in compliment to Bishop Compton, Dean of St Paul's. I also remember a row of 6 small almshouses, surrounded by a dwarf brick wall, standing in the middle of High Street. On the left hand of High Street, passing into Tottenham Court Road, there were 4 handsome brick houses, probably of Queen Anne's time, with grotesque masks as keystones to the first-floor windows. Nearly on the site of the new Resurrection Gate, in which the basso relievo is, stood a very small old house towards Denmark Street, which used to totter, to the terror of passers-by whenever a heavy carriage rolled through the street. Exactly where Oxford Street and Tottenham Court Road meet in a right angle, a large circular boundary stone was let into the pavement. Here, when the charity boys of St Giles's walked the boundaries, those who deserved floggings were whipped in order to impress the parish frontier on their memories. The Pound originally stood in the middle of the High Street, whence it was removed in 1656 to make way for the almshouses. It had stood there when the village really required a place to imprison straying cattle. The latest Pound stood in the broad space where the High Street, Tottenham Court Road and Oxford Street meet. It occupied a space of about 30 feet and was removed in 1768. It must have faced Meux's brewery. An old song that celebrates this locality begins, "At Newgate steps Jack Chance was found, and bred up near St Giles's Pound." Criminals on their way to Tyburn used to halt at the great gate of St Giles's Hospital, where a bowl of ale was provided as their last refreshment in this life. A similar custom prevailed at York, which gave rise to the proverb, "The saddler of Bawtry was hung for leaving his liquor," meaning that if the impatient man had stopped to drink, his reprieve would have arrived in time. Bowl Yard was built about 1623 and was then surrounded by gardens. It is a narrow court on the south side of High Street, over against Dyot Street, now George Street. There was probably here a public house, the Bowl, at which in later time ale was handed to the passing thieves. Swift, in a spirited ballad, describes clever Tom Clinch, who rode stately through Holborn to die in his calling, stopping at the George for a bottle of sack and promising to pay for it when he came back. No one has sketched the highwayman more perfectly than the Irish prelate. Tom Clinch wears waistcoat, stockings, and breeches of white, and his cap is tied with cherry ribbon. He bows like a beau at the theatre to the ladies in the doors and to the maids in the balconies, who cry, "Lack-a-day, he's a proper young man." He swears at the hawkers, crying his last speech, kicks the hangman when he kneels to ask his pardon, makes a short speech exhorting his comrades to ply their calling, and so carelessly and defiantly takes his leave of an ungrateful world. Rainy Day Smith describes when a boy of 8 years old being taken by Nollekens, the sculptor, to see that notorious highwayman, John Rann, alias 16-string Jack, on his way to execution at Tyburn, for robbing Dr. Bell, chaplain to the Princess Amelia, in Gunnersbury Lane, near Brentford, in 1774. Rann was a smart fellow, and had been a coachman to Lord Sandwich, who then lived on the south-east corner of Bedford Row, Covent Garden. The undaunted malefactor wore a bright pea-green coat and carried an immense nosegay, which some mistress of the highwayman had handed him, according to custom, as a last token from the steps of St Sepulchre's Church. The 16 strings worn by this freebooter at his knees were reported to be in ironical allusion to the number of times he had been acquitted. On their return home, Nollekens, stooping to the boy's ear, assured him that had his father-in-law, Mr Justice Welsh, been then High Constable, they could have walked all the way to Tyburn beside the cart. Holborn used to be called the Heavy Hill, because it led thieves from Newgate to Tyburn. Old Fat Ursula, the roast pig seller in Ben Jonson's Bartholomew Fair, talks of ambling afoot to hear Knockham, the footpad, groan out of a cart up the Heavy Hill. This was in James I's time. Dryden alludes to it in the same way in 1678, and in 1695 Congreve's Sir Sampson mentions the same doleful procession. In 1709, Queen Anne, Tom Brown mentions a wily old councillor in Holborn who used to turn out his clerks every execution day for a profitable holiday, saying, "Go, you young rogues, go to school and improve." St Giles was always famous for its inns. One of the oldest of these was the Croche House, or Croche Hose, Cross Hose, so called from its sign, the crossed stockings. The sign, still used by hosiers, was a red and white stocking forming a St Andrew's cross. The inn belonged to the hospital cook in 1300, and was given by him to the hospital. It stood at the north of the present entrance to Compton Street, and was probably destroyed before the reign of Henry VIII. The Swan on the Hop was an inn of Edward III's time. It stood eastward of Drury Lane and on the south side of Holborn. The White Hart is described in Henry VIII's time as possessing 18 acres of pasture. It stood near the Holborn end of Drury Lane and existed till 1720. In Aggas's plan it appears surrounded on 3 sides by a wall. It was bounded on the east by Little Queen Street and was divided from Holborn by an embankment. A court afterwards stood on its site. The Rose is mentioned as early as Edward III's reign. It was near Lewknor's Lane and stood not far from the White Hart. The Vine was an inn till 1816. It was on the north side of Holborn, a little to the east of Kingsgate Street. It is supposed to have stood on the site of a vineyard mentioned in Domesday Book. It was originally a country roadside inn with fields at the back. It became an infamous nuisance. The house that replaced it was first occupied by a timber merchant, and afterwards by Probert, the accomplice of Thurtle, who, escaping death for the murder of Mr. Weir, was soon after hanged for horse-stealing in Gloucestershire. It was at this trial that the prisoner's keeping a gig was adduced as an incontestable proof of his respectability, a fact immortalised almost to the weariness of a degenerate age by Mr. Thomas Carlyle. The inn was once called the Kingsgate Tavern, from its having stood near the Kingsgate or turnpike in the adjoining street. The Cock and Pie Inn stood at the west corner of what was once a mere or marshland. The fields surrounding it, now 7 dials, were called from it the Cock and Pie Fields. The Maidenhead Inn stood in Dyer Street and formed part of Lord Mountjoy's estates in Elizabeth's time. It was the house for parish meetings in Charles II's reign. It then became a resort for mealmen and farmers, and latterly a brandy shop and beggar's haunt of the vilest sort. It was finally turned into a stone-yard. Dyot Street, so called after Sir John Dyot, who left it by wish to the poor, though it was afterwards a poor and even dangerous locality, must have been respectable in 1662, when a Presbyterian chapel was built there for Joseph Reed, Baxter's friend, an ejected minister from Worcestershire. Reed was taken up under the Conventicles Act in 1677 and endured much persecution, but was restored to his congregation on the accession of James II. From 1684 to 1708 the building was used as a chapel of ease to St Giles's Church. At the close of the last century men would hurry along Dyot Street as though a dangerous defile. There was a legend current of a banker's clerk who, returning from his round, with his book of notes and bills fastened by the usual chain, as he passed down Dyot Street felt a cellar door sinking under him. Conscious of his danger, he made a spring forward, dashed down the street, and escaped the trap set for him by the thieves. It may be added that Dyot Street gave the name to a song sung by Liston in the admirable burlesque of Bombastes Furioso. Irish mendicants, the poorest, dirtiest, and most unimprovable of all beggars, began to crowd into St Giles's about the time of Queen Elizabeth. The increase of London soon attracted country artisans and country beggars. The closing of the monasteries had filled England with herds of sturdy and dangerous vagrants not willing to work, and by no means inclined to starve. The newcomers, resorting to the suburbs of London to escape the penalties of infringing the city jurisdiction, the stout-hearted Queen ordered all persons within 3 miles of London gates to forbear from allowing any house to be occupied by more than one family. A proclamation of 1583 alludes to the very poor and the beggars who lived heaped up in small tenements and let lodgings. A subsequent warning orders the suppression of the great multitude of Irish vagrants, many of whom haunted the courts under the pretence of suits. By day they mixed with disbanded soldiers from the Low Countries and other impostors and beggars, and at night committed robberies and outrages. St Giles's was then one of the great harbours for these misdemeaned persons. On one occasion a mob of these rogues surrounded the Queen as she was riding out in the evening to Islington to take the air. That same night Fleetwood, the recorder, issued warrants, and in the morning went out himself and took 74 rogues, including some blind rich usurers, who were all sent to Bridewell for speedy punishment. James I pursued the same crusade against vagrants, forbidding new buildings in the suburbs and ordering all newly raised structures to be pulled down. The beadles had to attend every Sunday at the vestry to report all new inmates, and who lodged them, and to take up all idlers. The constables in 1630 were also required to give notice of such persons to the churchwardens every month. In an entry in St Giles's parish books in 1637, families in cellars are first mentioned. The locality afterwards became noted for these dens, and a cellar in St Giles's became a proverbial phrase to signify the lowest poverty. In 1640, Irishmen are first mentioned by name, and money was paid to take them back again to their native land. Sir John Fielding, brother of the great novelist, who was an active Westminster magistrate in his time and a great hunter down of highwaymen, in a pamphlet on the increase of crime in London, lays special stress on the vicious poverty of St Giles's. He gives a statement on the authority of Mr Welsh, the High Constable of Holborn, of the overcrowding of the miserable lodgings where idle persons and vagabonds were sheltered for twopence a night. One woman alone owned 7 of these houses, which were crowded with twopenny beds from cellar to garret. In these beds both sexes, strangers or not, lay promiscuously, the double bed being a halfpenny cheaper. To still more wed vice to poverty, these lodging housekeepers sold gin at a penny a quartern, so that no beggar was so poor that he could not get drunk. No fewer than 70 of these vile houses were found open at all hours, and in one alone, and not the largest, there were counted 58 persons sleeping in an atmosphere loathsome, if not actually poisonous. This Judge Welsh was the father of Mrs Nollekens, and a brave and benevolent man. He was a friend of Dr Johnson, and of Fielding, whom he succeeded in his justiceship. Mr Welsh, having on one occasion heard that notorious highwayman who infested the Marleman lanes was sleeping in the first floor of a house in Rose Street, Long Acre, he hired the tallest hackney coach he could find, drove under the thief's window, ascended the roof, threw up the sash, entered the room, actually dragged the fellow naked out of bed onto the roof of the coach, and in that way carried him down New Street and up St Martin's Lane, amidst the huzzas of an immense throng which followed him to Lichfield Street, Soho. Archenholz, the German traveller, writing circa 1784, describes the streets of London as crowded with beggars. These idle people, says this curious observer, receive in alms 3, 4, and even 5 shillings a day. They have their clubs in the parish of St Giles's, where they meet, drink, and feed well, read the papers, and talk politics. One of my friends put on one day a ragged coat, and promised a handsome reward to a beggar to introduce him to his club. He found the beggars gay and familiar, and poor only in their rags. One threw down his crutch, another untied a wooden leg, a third took off a grey wig or removed a plaister from a sound eye. Then they related their adventures and planned fresh schemes. The female beggars hired children for 6pence, and sometimes even 2 shillings a day. A very deformed child is worth 4 shillings. In the same parish the pickpockets met to dine and exchange or sell snuff-boxes, handkerchiefs, and other stolen property. About 50 years before, says Archenholz, there had been a pickpockets' club in St Giles's, where the knives and forks were chained to the table and the cloth was nailed on. Rules were, however, decorously observed and chairmen chosen at their meetings. Not far from this house was a celebrated gin shop, on the signpost of which was written, "Here you may get drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2pence, and straw for nothing." The cellars of this public-spirited man were never empty. Archenholz also sketches the conjurers who told fortunes for a shilling. They wore black gowns and false beards, advertised in the newspapers, and painted their houses with magical figures and planetary emblems. In 1783, Mr. J.T. Smith describes how he made for Mr. Crowle, the illustrator of Pennant, a sketch of old Simon, a well-known character who took his station daily under one of the gate piers of the old red and brown brick gateway at the northern end of St Giles's churchyard, which then faced Mr. Remnant's timber yard. This man wore several hats and was remarkable for a long, dirty, yellowish-white beard. His chapped fingers were adorned with brass rings. He had several coats and waistcoats, the upper wrap-rassel covering bundles of rags, parcels of books, canisters of bread and cheese, matches, a tinder-box, meat for his dogs, scraps from Fox's Book of Martyrs, and 3 or 4 dog's-eared, thumbed, and greasy numbers of the Gentleman's Magazine. From these random leaves he gathered much information, which he retailed to persons who stopped to look at him. Simon and his dog lodged under a staircase in an old shattered building in Dyot Street known as Rat's Castle. It was in this beggars' rendezvous that Nollekens the sculptor used to seek models for his Grecian Venuses. Rowlandson etched Simon several times in his usual gross but droll manner. There was also a whole-length print of him published by John Seager with this monumental inscription: Simon Eadie, born at Woodford near Thrapston, Northamptonshire, in 1709, died May 18th, 1783. Simon had had several dogs, which, one after the other, were stolen and sent for sale at Islington, or killed for their teeth by men employed by the dentists. The following anecdote is told of his last and most faithful dog. Rover had been a shepherd's dog at Harrow, and having its left eye struck out by a bullock's horn, was left with Simon by its master, a Smithfield drover. The beggar tied him to his arm with a long string, cured him, and then restored him to the drover. After that the dog would stop at St. Giles's Porch every market day, on its way after the drover to the slaughter-house in Union Street, and receive caresses from the hand which had bathed its wound. Rover would then yelp for joy and gratitude, and scamper off to get up with the erring bullocks. At last poor Simon missed the dog for several weeks. At the end of that time it appeared one morning at his feet, and with its one sorrowful and uplifted eye implored Simon's protection by licking his tawny beard. His master the drover was dead. Simon was only too glad to adopt Rover, who eventually followed him to his last home. There was an elegy printed for good-natured, inoffensive old Simon with a woodcut portrait attached. The Honourable Daines Barrington is said to have never passed the old mendicant without giving him sixpence. Mr. J.T. Smith, himself afterwards curator of the prints at the British Museum, published some curious etchings of beggars and street characters in 1815. Amongst them are ragged men carrying placards of the Grand Golden Lottery, strange old clothesmen in cocked hats and two-tier wigs, itinerant wood merchants, sellers of toys, such as young lambs, or live haddock, flying piemen in pigtails and shorts, women in gipsy hats, doormat sellers, vendors of hot peas, pickled cucumbers, lemons, windmills, toys, and last and least, Sir Harry Dimmesdale, the dwarf mayor of Garratt. The condition of the beggars of St. Giles in 1815 we gather pretty accurately from the evidence given by Mr. Sampson Stevenson, overseer of the parish, and by trade and ironmonger at No. 11 King Street, 7 Dials, before a committee of the House of Commons, the Right Honourable George Rose in the chair. Mr. Stevenson's shop was not more than a few yards from one of the beggars' chief rendezvous, and he had therefore been enabled to closely study their habits. The inn had lost its licence as the landlord encouraged thieves, and he had made inquiries of petition writers, the highest class of mendicants. He had gone frequently into the bar of the Fountain in King Street, another of their haunts, to watch their goings-on. The pretended sailors never carried anything on their backs, as they only begged or extorted money, but the other rogues, who made it their practice to ask for food and clothing, always carried a knapsack to put it in. They returned laden with shoes and clothes which they would sell in Monmouth Street. They had been heard to say that they had made 3 or 4 shillings a day by begging shoes alone. Their mode of obtaining charity was to go barefoot and scarify their heels so that the blood might show. They went out 2 or 3 together, or more, and invariably changed their routes each day. Mr. Stevenson had seen them pull out their money and share it. Victuals, he believed, they threw away, but everything else they sold. They would stop at the Fountain till the house closed, or till they got drunk, began to fight, and were turned out by the publican, who feared the losing his licence. They probably went to even lower places to finish their revel. They teach each other, he said, different modes of extortion. They are of the worst character, and overwhelm you with cursing and abuse if you refuse them money. There is one special rascal, Ganny Manos, who is scarcely 3 months in the year out of jail. He always goes barefoot, and scratches his ankles to make them bleed. He is the greatest collector of shoes and clothes, as he goes the most naked to excite compassion. Another man had been known in the streets for 15 or 20 years. He generally limped or passed as a cripple, but Mr. Stevenson has seen him fencing and jumping about like a pugilist. He went without a hat, with bare arms and a canvas bag on his back. He generally began by singing a song, and he carried primroses or something in his hand. He pretended to be scarcely able to move one foot before the other, but if a Bow Street officer or a beadle came in sight, he was off as quick as anyone. There was another man, an Irishman, who had had a good education, and had been in the medical line. He wrote a beautiful hand and drew up petitions for beggars at sixpence or a shilling each. These men come out by 20s and 30s from the bottom of Dyot Street, and then branch off 5 or 6 together. The one who has still some money left starts them with a pint or half a pint of gin. They have all their divisions, and they quarter the town into sections. Some of them collect 3, 4, or 5 children, paying sixpence a day for each, and then they go begging in gangs, setting the children crying to excite people's sympathies. The Irish sometimes have the impudence to bring these children to the board and claim relief, and swear the children are their own. In a short time they are found out, but till the discovery their landlords will swear their story is true. Sometimes by giving their own country people something, the landlords help to detect them, but even in cases where the children are their own, they will not work when they have once got into the habit of begging. If they will not come into the workhouse, their relief is instantly stopped. They spend their evenings drinking after dining at an eating house. Deserving people never beg. They are ashamed of it. They do not eat broken victuals. They have seldom any lodgings. There are houses where 40 or 50 of them sleep. A porter stands at the door and takes the money. In the morning there is a general muster to see they have stolen nothing, and then the doors are unlocked. For 3 they have clean straw, for 4 something more decent, and for 6 a bed. These are all professional beggars. They beg every day, even Sundays. They will not work. They get more money by begging. Sometimes during hard frosts they pretend to beg for work, but their children are sent out early by their parents to certain prescribed stations to beg, sometimes with a broom. If they do not bring home more or less according to their size, they are beaten. A large family of children is a revenue to these people. When beggars did not get enough for their subsistence, Mr. Stevenson believed that they had a fund amongst themselves, as they so seldom applied for relief. The Irish were generally afraid to apply, for fear of being returned to their own country. Beggars had been heard to brag of getting 6, 7, and 8 shillings a day or more, and if one got more than the others, he divided it with the rest. Mr. Stevenson concluded his evidence by saying that there were so many low Irish in St. Giles's that out of £30,000 a year collected in that parish by poor rate, £20,000 went to this low and shifting population, that decreased in summer and increased in winter. From 1 or 2 specimens culled from the London newspapers in 1829, we do not augur much improvement in the character and habits of the St. Giles's beggars. On the 12th of July, 1829, John Driscoll, an old professional mendicant, was brought up at the Marylebone Police Office, charged with begging, annoying respectable persons, and even following fashionably dressed ladies into shops. In his pockets were found a small sum of money, some ham sandwiches, and an invitation ticket signed Car Durre, Chairman. It requested the favour of Mr. Driscoll's company on Monday evening next at 7 o'clock at the Robin Hood, Church Street, St. Giles, for the purpose of taking supper with others in his line of calling or profession. Mr. Rawlinson said he supposed that an alderman in chains would grace the beggars' festive board, but he would at least prevent the prisoner forming one of the party on Monday and sent him to the House of Corrections for 14 days. The same day one of these men who chalk "I am starving" on the pavement was also sent to the treadmill for 14 days. Francis Fisher, the prisoner in question, was one of a gang of 40 pavement chalkers. In the evening, after work, these men changed their dress and with their ladies enjoyed themselves over a good supper, brandy and water, and cigars. In the winter time, when they excited more compassion, their average earnings were 10 shillings a day. This would make £20 a day for the gang, and no less than £7,300 a year. Monmouth Street is generally supposed to have derived its name from the Duke of Monmouth, Charles II's natural son, whose townhouse stood close by in Soho Square. It was perhaps named from Carey, Earl of Monmouth, who died in 1626, and his son, who died in 1661. They were both parishioners of St. Giles's. It was early known as the Great Mart for Old Clothes, but was superseded in later times by Holy Well Street, which in its turn was displaced by the Minories. Lady Mary Wortley alludes to the lace coats hung up for sale in Monmouth Street like Irish patents. Even Prior, in his pleasant metaphysical poem of Alma, says, This looketh, friend Dick, as nature had but exercised a salesman's trade, and if she haply had sat down and cut out clothes for all the town, then sent them out to Monmouth Street to see what persons they would fit. Gay also alludes to this Jewish street in the following distich in his Trivia. Thames Street gives cheeses, Covent Garden fruits, Moorfields old books, and Monmouth Street old suits. Most of the shops in Monmouth Street were occupied by Jew dealers in 1849, and horseshoes were then to be seen nailed under the doorsteps of the sellers to scare away witches. Mr. Charles Dickens, in his Sketches by Boz, published in 1836-7, describes Seven Dials and Monmouth Street as they then appeared. The maze of streets, the unwholesome atmosphere, the men in fustians spotted with brick dust or whitewash, and chronically leaning against posts, are all painted by this great artist with the accuracy of a Dutch painter. The writer boldly plunges into the region of first effusions and last dying speeches hallowed by the names of Catnach and of Pitts, and carries us at once into a fight between two half-drunk Irish termagants outside a gin shop. He then takes us to the dirty, straggling houses, the dark chandler's shop, the rag and bone stores, the broker's den, the bird fancier's room as full as Noah's Ark, and completes the picture with a background of dirty men, filthy women, squalid children, fluttering shuttlecocks, noisy battledores, reeking pipes, bad fruit, more than doubtful oysters, attenuated cats, depressed dogs, and anatomized fowls. Every house has, he says, at least a dozen tenants. The man in the shop is in the baked jemmy line, or deals in firewood and hearthstones. An Irish labourer and his family occupy the back kitchen, while a jobbing carpet beater is in the front. In the front one pair, there's another family, and in the back one pair, a young woman who takes in tambour work. In the back attic is a mysterious man who never buys anything but coffee, penny loaves, and ink, and is supposed to write poems for Mr. Warren. The Monmouth Street inhabitants Mr. Dickens describes as a peaceable, thoughtful, and dirty race, who immure themselves in deep cellars or small back parlours, and seldom come forth till the dusk and cool of the evening, when, seated in chairs on the pavement, smoking their pipes, they watch the gambols of their children as they revel in the gutter, a happy troop of infantine scavengers. A Monmouth Street laced coat was a byword a century ago, but still we find Monmouth Street the same. Pilot coats, double-breasted check waistcoats, low, broad-brimmed coachmen's hats, and skeleton suits have usurped the place of the old attire. But Monmouth Street, said Charles Dickens, is still the burial place of the fashions, and we love to walk among these extensive groves of the illustrious dead, and indulge in the speculations to which they give rise. In 1816 there was said to be 2,348 Irish people resident in St Giles's, but an Irish witness before a committee of the House declared that there were 6,000 Irish and 3,000 children in the neighbourhood of George Street alone. In 1815 there were 14,164 Irish in the whole of London. The Irish portion of the parish of St Giles's was known by the name of the Holy Land in 1829. End of section 23. Recording by Ian Stewart, Rosanna, Victoria, Australia.
Chapter 14, Part 1 of Haunted London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Haunted London by Walter Thornbury. Chapter 14, Lincoln's Inn Fields, Part 1. Lincoln's Inn, originally belonging to the Black Friars before they removed Thamesward, derives its name from Henry de Lacy, Earl of Lincoln, to whom it was given by Edward I, and whose townhouse or inn stood on the same site in the reign of Edward I. Earl Henry died in 1312, the year in which Gaveston was killed, and his monument was one of the stateliest in the old church. His arms are still those of the inn and of its tributaries, Furnival's and Thavies inns. There is yet extant an old account of the Earl's bailiff relating to the sale of the fruit of his master's garden. The noble's table was supplied and the residue sold. The apples, pears, large nuts and cherries, the beans, onions, garlic, and leeks produced a profit of £9 2 and 3, about £135 in modern money. The only flowers were roses. The bailiff, it appears, expended 8 shillings a year in purchasing small fry, frogs, and eels to feed the pike in the pond or vivary. Part of the Chancery Lane side of Lincoln's Inn was in 1217 and 1272 the mansion house of William de Haverhill, treasurer to King Henry III. He was attainted for treason, and his house and lands were confiscated to the king, who then gave his house to Ralph Neville, Chancellor of England and Bishop of Chichester, who built there a fair house, and the bishops of Chichester inhabited it there till Henry VII's time, when they let it to law students, reserving lodgings for themselves, and it fell into the hands of Judge Sulyard and other feoffees. This family held it till Elizabeth's time, when Sir Edward Sulyard of Essex sold the estate to the Benchers, who then began enlarging their frontier and building. The plain Tudor gateway, with the 2 side towers soaked with black smoke, the oldest part of the existing structure, was built in 1518 by Sir Thomas Lovell, a member of this inn and treasurer of the household to Henry VII, when great alterations took place in the inn. What thousands of wise men and rogues have passed under its murky shadow! None of the original building is left. The Blackfriars House fronted the Holborn end of the bishop's palace. The chambers adjoining the gatehouse are of a later date, and it was at these that Mr. Cunningham thinks Ben Jonson worked. The chapel, of debased Perpendicular Gothic, was built by Inigo Jones, and consecrated in 1623, Dr. Donne the poet preaching the consecration sermon. The stained glass was the work of a Mr. Hale of Fetter Lane. The 12 apostles, Moses, and the prophets still glow like immortal flowers, bright as when Donne or Usher watched the light they shed. One of the windows bears the name of Bernard Van Linge, the same man, probably, who executed the windows at Wadham College, Oxford. Noy, the Attorney General and creature of Charles I, a friend of Laud, and the proposer of the writ for ship money, put up the window representing John the Baptist, rather an ominous saint, surely, in Charles's time. Noy died in 1634, before the storm which would certainly have carried his head off. He left his money to a prodigal son, who was afterwards killed in a duel. Left to be squandered, and I hope no better from him, says the dying man bitterly. It was Noy who decided the curious case of the 3 graziers who left their money with their hostess. One of them afterwards returned and ran off with the money, upon which the other 2 sued the woman, denying their consent. Mr. Noy pleaded that the money was ready to be given up directly the 3 men came together and claimed it. Rogers tells this story in his poem of Italy, and gives it a romantic turn. Laud, always restless for novelties that could look like Rome and yet not be Rome, referred to the Lincoln's Inn windows at his trial. He wondered at a Mr. Brown objecting to such things, considering he was not of Lincoln's Inn, where Mr. Prynne's zeal had not yet beaten down the images of the apostles in the fair windows of that chapel, which windows were set up new long since the statute of Edward VI, and it is well known, says that enemy of the Puritans, that I was once resolved to have returned this upon Mr. Brown in the House of Commons, but changed my mind, lest thereby I might have set some furious spirit at work to destroy those harmless goodly windows, to the just dislike of that worthy society. The crypt under the chapel rests on many pillars and strong-backed arches, and, like the cloisters in the temple, was intended as a place for student lawyers to walk in and exchange learning. Butler describes witnesses of the straw bale species waiting here for customers, just as half a century ago they used to haunt the doors of Chancery Lane gin shops. On a June day in 1663, Pepys came to walk under the chapel by appointment, after pacing up and down and admiring the new garden then constructing. The great Sir Thomas More, Chancellor of England in Henry VIII's time, had chambers at Lincoln's Inn when he was living in Bucklersbury after his marriage. This was about 1506. He wrote his Utopia in 1516. King Henry grew so fond of More's learned and witty conversation that he used to constantly send for him to supper, and would walk in the garden at Chelsea with his arm round his neck. More was beheaded in 1535 for refusing to take the oath of succession and acknowledge the legality of the king's divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Erasmus, who knew More well, inscribed the Nux of Ovid to his son. More's skull is still preserved, it is said, in the vault of St. Dunstan's Church at Canterbury. More's daughter, Margaret Roper, was buried with it in her arms. Dr. Donne, the divine and poet, whose mother was distantly related to Sir Thomas More and to Heywood the epigrammatist, was a student at Lincoln's Inn in his 17th year, but left it to squander his father's fortune. He was a friend of Bacon, with whom he lived for 5 years, and also of Ben Jonson, who corresponded with him. When young, Donne had written a thesis to prove that suicide is no sin. That, he used to say in later years, was written by Jack Donne, not by Dr. Donne. This same poet was for 2 years preacher at Lincoln's Inn. So was the charitable and amiable Tillotson in 1663. The latter, after preaching the doctrine of non-resistance before King Charles II, was nicknamed Hobbes in the pulpit. He and Dr. Burnet both tried in vain to force the same doctrine on Lord William Russell when he was preparing for death. Tillotson, who was made Archbishop of Canterbury in 1691 by King William, was a valued friend of Locke. Addison considered Tillotson's 3-folio volumes of sermons to be the standard of English, and meant to make them the groundwork of a dictionary which he had projected. Warburton, a sterner critic, denies that the sermons are oratorical like Jeremy Taylor's, or thoughtful like Barrow's, but yet confesses them to be clear, rational, equable, and certainly not without a noble simplicity. Among the most eminent students of Lincoln's Inn we must remember Sir Matthew Hale. After a wild and vain youth, Hale suddenly commenced studying 16 hours a day, and became so careless of dress that he was once seized by a press gang. The sight of a friend who fell down in a fit from excessive drinking led to this honest man's renouncing all revelry and becoming unchangeably religious. Noy directed him in his studies. He became a friend of Selden, and was one of the counsel for Strafford, Laud, and the king himself. Nevertheless, he obtained the esteem of Cromwell, who was tolerant of all shades of goodness. He died 1675–6. When a nobleman once complained to Charles II that Hale would not discuss with him the arguments in his cause then before him, Charles replied, "Odds fish, man, he would have treated me just the same." Lord Chancellor Egerton, afterwards Lord Ellesmere, was of Lincoln's Inn. His son became Earl of Bridgewater. He was a friend of Lord Bacon, and had a celebrated dispute with Chief Justice Coke as to whether the Chancery can relieve by subpoena after a judgment at law in the same cause. Prudent, discreet, and honest, Ellesmere was esteemed by both Elizabeth and James, and died at York House in 1617. Bishop Hacket says of him that he neither did, spoke, nor thought anything in his life but what deserved praise. It is said that many persons used to go to the Chancery Court only to see and admire his venerable presence. Sir Henry Spelman was admitted of Lincoln's Inn. He was a friend of Dugdale, and one of our earliest students of Anglo-Saxon. He wrote much on civil law, sacrilege, and tithes. Aubrey tells us that he was thought a dunce at school, and did not seriously sit down to hard study till he was about 40. This eminent scholar died in 1641, and was interred with great solemnity in Westminster Abbey. Shaftesbury, the subtle and dangerous, and one of the restorers of the king he afterwards worked so hard to depose, was of Lincoln's Inn. Ashmole, the great herald, antiquary, and numismatist, originally a London attorney, was married in Lincoln's Inn Chapel in 1668 to the daughter of his great colleague in topography and heraldry, Sir William Dugdale, the part compiler of the Monasticon. In the chapel was buried Alexander Brome, a royalist attorney, a translator of Horace, and a great writer of sharp songs against the Rump, who died in 1666. Here also, in loving companionship with him only because dead, rests that irritable Puritan lawyer, William Prynne. He twice lost an ear in the pillory, besides being branded on the cheek. He ultimately opposed Cromwell, and aided the return of Charles, for which he was made Keeper of the Tower Records. His works amount to 40 folio and quarto volumes. He left copies of them to the Lincoln's Inn Library. Needham calls him the greatest paperworm that ever crept into a library. He died in his Lincoln's Inn chambers in 1669. Wood computes that Prynne wrote as much as would amount to a sheet for every day of his life. His epitaph had been erased when Wood wrote the Athenae Oxonienses in 1691. In the same chapel lies Secretary Thurlow, the son of an Essex rector and the faithful servant of Cromwell. He was admitted of Lincoln's Inn in 1647, and in 1654 was chosen one of the masters of the upper bench. He died suddenly in his chambers in Lincoln's Inn in 1668. Dr. Birch published several folio volumes of his State Papers. He seems to have been an honest, dull, plodding man. Thurlow's chambers were at number 24 in the south angle of the great court leading out of Chancery Lane, formerly called the Gatehouse Court, but now Old Buildings, the rooms on the left hand of the ground floor. Here Thurlow had chambers from 1645 to 1659. Cromwell must have often come here to discuss dissolutions of Parliament and Dutch treaties. State papers sufficient to fill 67 folio volumes were discovered in a false ceiling in the garret by a clergyman who had borrowed the chambers of a friend during the long vacation. He disposed of them to Lord Chancellor Somers. Cautious old Thurlow had perhaps sown these papers, hoping to reap the harvest under some new Cromwellian dynasty that never came. Rushworth, the historian, was a barrister of Lincoln's Inn. During the Civil Wars he was assistant clerk to the House of Commons. After the Restoration he became secretary to the Lord Keeper, but falling into distress, died in the King's Bench in 1690. His 8 folio volumes of historical collections are specially valuable. Sir John Denham also studied in this pasturing ground of English genius, and here, after squandering all his money in gaming, he wrote an essay upon the vice that brings its own punishment. In 1641, when his tragedy of The Sophie appeared, Waller said that Denham had broken out like the Irish rebellion, 70,000 strong. In 1643 appeared his Cooper's Hill, which the lampooners declared the author had bought of a vicar for £40. He became mad for a short time at the close of life, and was then ridiculed by Butler, so says Dr. Johnson. He died in 1668, and was interred in Westminster Abbey. Denham and Waller smoothed the way for Dryden, and founded the Pope school of highly polished artificial verse. Denham's noble apostrophe to the river Thames is all but perfect. George Wither, one of our fine old poets of a true school, rougher but more natural than Denham's, the son of a Hampshire farmer, entered at Lincoln's Inn. Sent to the Marshalsea for his just but indiscreet satires, he turned soldier, fought against the Royalists, and became one of Cromwell's dreaded major generals. He was in Newgate for a long time after the Restoration, and died in 1667. When taken prisoner by Charles, Sir John Denham obtained his release on the humorous pretext that, while Wither lived, he, Denham, would not be the worst poet in England. In No. 1 New Square, Arthur Murphy, the friend of Dr. Johnson, resided for 23 years. He became a member of the inn in 1757. In 1788 he sold his chambers and retired from the bar. As a journalist he was ridiculed by Wilkes and Churchill. His plays, The Grecian Daughter and 3 Weeks After Marriage, were successful. He also translated Tacitus and Sallust. He died in 1805. Judge Fortescue, a great English lawyer of the time of Henry VI., was a student of this inn. He wrote his great work De Laudibus Legum Angliae to educate Prince Edward when in banishment in Lorraine. This pious, loyal, and learned man, after being nominal chancellor, returned to retirement in England and acknowledged Edward IV. The Earl of Mansfield belonged to the same illustrious inn. For elegance of mind, for honesty and industry, and for eloquence, he stands unrivalled. The proceedings against Wilkes, and the destruction of his house in Bloomsbury by the fanatical mob of 1780, were the chief events of his useful life. Spencer Perceval was of Lincoln's Inn. A son of the Earl of Egmont, he became a student here in 1782. In Parliament he supported Pitt and the war against Napoleon. In 1801, under the Addington ministry, he became Attorney General, and persecuted Peltier for a libel on Bonaparte during the Peace of Amiens. On the death of the Duke of Portland, he was raised to the head of the Treasury, where he continued till May 1812, when he was shot through the heart in the lobby of the House of Commons by Bellingham, a bankrupt merchant of Archangel, who considered himself aggrieved because ministers had not taken his part and claimed redress for his losses from the Russian government. Perceval was a shrewd, even-tempered lawyer, fluent and industrious, who, had time been permitted him, might possibly have proved more completely than he did his incapacity for high ministerial command. George Canning became a student at Lincoln's Inn in 1781. His father was a bankrupt wine merchant who died of a broken heart. His mother was a provincial actress. His relation, Sheridan, introduced him to Fox, Gray, and Burke, the latter of whom, it is said, induced him to make politics his profession. He made his maiden speech attacking Fox and supporting Pitt in 1794. Late in life he gradually began to support some liberal measures. In 1827 he became First Lord of the Treasury, and died a few months afterwards, in the zenith of his power. Lord Lyndhurst was also one of the glories of this inn. The trial of Dr. Watson for treason in 1817 first gained for this son of an American painter a reputation which, joined with his prudent conduct in the trial of Cashman the rioter, led to his being appointed Solicitor General in 1818. From that he rose in rapid succession to the posts of Attorney General, Master of the Rolls, Lord Chancellor, and Lord Lyndhurst. Old, eccentric, irrepressible, Sir Charles Wetherell was Copley's fellow advocate in Watson's case that ended in the prisoner's acquittal. In 1827, when Abbott became Lord Tenterden, Copley accepted the Great Seal, displacing Lord Eldon, and joined Canning's cabinet, becoming Lord Lyndhurst. In 1830 he became Chief Baron of the Exchequer. Charles Pepys, Lord Cottenham, born 1781, was called to the bar by the Society of Lincoln's Inn in 1804. He was appointed King's Counsel in 1826, was made Solicitor General in 1834, succeeded Sir John Leach as Master of the Rolls in the same year, and was elevated to the woolsack in 1836. This Chancellor, who was a very excellent lawyer, was descended from a branch of the family of Samuel Pepys, author of the celebrated Diary. Sir E. Sugden was a member of Lincoln's Inn. He was born in the year 1781. He was the son of a Westminster hairdresser, who became rich by inventing a substitute for hair powder. He was created Lord St. Leonards on the formation of a Conservative ministry in 1852, when he accepted the Great Seal. Lord Brougham also studied in Lincoln's Inn. He was born in 1778, and started the Edinburgh Review in 1802. In 1820 he defended Queen Caroline, but it would take a volume to follow the career of this impetuous and versatile genius. His struggles for law reform, for Catholic emancipation, for abolition of slavery, for the education of the people, and for parliamentary reform are matters of history. In his old age, though still vigorous, Lord Brougham grew tamer, and condemned the armed emancipation of slaves practiced by the Northern States in the present American War. He died at his residence at Caen, in the south of France, in 1868. Cottenham and Campbell were students in Lincoln's Inn. So was that eccentric reformer Jeremy Bentham, who was called to the bar in 1722, and was the son of a Houndsditch attorney, and so was Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania. That luminary of the Irish Church, Archbishop Usher, was preacher at Lincoln's Inn in 1647, the society giving the good man handsome rooms ready furnished. He continued to preach there for 8 years, till his eyesight began to fail. He died in 1655, and was buried by Cromwell's permission with great magnificence in Erasmus's chapel in Westminster Abbey. His library of 10,000 volumes, bought of him by Cromwell's officers, was given by Charles II to Dublin College. Usher, when only 18, was the David who discomfited in public dispute the learned Jesuit Fitzsimons. He saw Charles beheaded from the roof of a house on the site of the Admiralty. Dr. Langhorne, the joint translator with his brother of the Lives of Plutarch, was assistant preacher at Lincoln's Inn. An imitator of Sterne, and a writer in Griffith's Monthly Review, he was praised by Smollett and abused by Churchill. Langhorne's amiable poem, The Country Justice, was praised by Scott. He died in 1779. That fiery controversialist, Warburton, was preacher at Lincoln's Inn in 1746, and the same year preached and published a sermon on the Highland Rebellion. He was the son of an attorney at Newark-upon-Trent. His Divine Legation was an effort to show that the absence of allusions in the writings of Moses to a system of rewards and punishments was a proof of their divine origin. The book is full of perverse digressions. His edition of Shakespeare is, perhaps to use a fine expression of Burke, one of the poorest maggots that ever crept from the great man's carcass. Pope left half his library to Warburton, who had suggested to him the conclusion of the Dunciad. Wilkes, Bolingbroke, Dr. Louth, and Churchill were all by turns attacked by this arrogant knight-errant. Warburton died in 1779. Reginald Heber, afterwards the excellent Bishop of Calcutta, was appointed preacher at Lincoln's Inn in 1822, the year before he sailed for India. In 1826 this good man was found dead in his bath at Trichinopoly. The sudden death of this energetic missionary was a great loss to East Indian Christianity. In the company of the preachers we must not forget the excellent Dr. Van Mildert, afterwards Bishop of Durham, and Dr. Thompson, the present Archbishop of York. In the old times the Lord Chancellor held his sittings in the great hall of Lincoln's Inn. Here, too, at the Christmas revels, the King of the Cockneys administered his laws. Jack Straw, a sort of rebellious rival, was put down, with all his adherents, as a bad precedent for the Essexes and Norfolks of the inn, by wary Queen Elizabeth, who always kept a firm grip on her prerogative. In the same reign, absurd sumptuary laws, vainly trying to fix the quicksilver of fashion, forbade the students to wear long hair, long beards, large ruffs, huge cloaks, or big spurs. The fine for wearing a beard of more than a fortnight's growth was 3s. 4d. In her father's time beards had been prohibited under pain of double commons. In the old hall, replaced by the new Tudor building, stood one of Hogarth's most pretentious but worst pictures, Paul preaching before Felix, an ill-drawn and ludicrous caricature of epic work. The Society paid for it. It is now rolled up and hid away with as much contumely as Kent's absurdity at St. Clement's when Hogarth parodied it. The new hall of Lincoln's Inn was built by Mr. P. Hardwick, the architect of the St. Catherine Docks, and was opened by the Queen in person in 1845. It is a fine Tudor building of red brick, with stone dressings. The hall is 120 feet, the library 80 feet long. The contract was taken for £55,000, but its cost exceeded that sum. The library contains the unique 4th volume of Prynne's Records, which the Society bought for £335 at the Stowe sale in 1849, and all Sir Matthew Hale's bequests of books and MSS. A treasure, says that excellent good man, as Evelyn calls him in his will, that is not fit for every man's view. The hall contains a fresco representing the Lawgivers of the World by Watts. The gardens were much curtailed by the erection of the hall, and their quietude destroyed. Ben Jonson talks of the walks under the elms. Steele seems to have been fond of this garden when he felt meditative. In May 1709 he says, much hurry and business having perplexed him into a mood too thoughtful for company, instead of the tavern, I went into Lincoln's Inn Walk, and having taken a round or two, I sat down, according to the allowed familiarity of these places, on a bench. In a more thoughtful month, November, of the same year, he goes again for a solitary walk in the garden, a favour that is indulged me by several of the benchers, who are very intimate friends, and grown old in the neighbourhood. It was this bright frosty night, when the whole body of air had been purified into bright transparent ether, that Steele imagined his vision of the return of the Golden Age. Brave old Ben Jonson was the son of a Scotch gentleman in Henry VIII's service, who, impoverished by the persecutions of Queen Mary, took orders late in life. His mother married for the second time a small builder or master bricklayer. He went to Westminster School, where Camden, the great antiquary, was his master. A kind patron sent him to Cambridge. He seems to have left college prematurely, and have come back to London to work with his father-in-law. There is an old tradition that he worked at the garden wall of Lincoln's Inn, next to Chancery Lane, and that a knight or bencher, Sutton or Camden, walking by, hearing him repeat a passage of Homer, entered into conversation with him, and, finding him to have extraordinary wit, sent him back to college, or, as Fuller quaintly puts it, some gentlemen pitying that his parts should be buried under the rubbish of so mean a calling, did by their bounty manumise him freely to follow his own ingenious inclinations. Gifford sneers at the story, for the poet's own words to Drummond of Hawthornden were simply these: he could not endure the occupation of a bricklayer, and therefore joined Vere in Flanders, probably going with reinforcements to Ostend in 1591–2. He there fought and slew an enemy, and stripped him in sight of both armies. On his return he became an actor at a Shoreditch theatre. His enemies, the rival satirists, frequently sneer at the quondam profession of Ben Jonson, and describe him stamping on the stage as if he were treading mortar. For myself, I admire brave, truculent old Ben, and delight even in his most crabbed and pedantic verse, and therefore never pass Lincoln's Inn garden without thinking of Shakespeare's honest but rugged friend, a bear only in the coat. On June 27, 1752, there was a dreadful fire in New Square, which destroyed countless historical treasures, including Lord Somers' original letters and papers. At No. 2, and afterwards at No. 6 New Square, Lincoln's Inn, which is built on Little Lincoln's Inn Fields, and forms no part of the Inn of Court, lived Sir Samuel Romilly. This great and amiable man, as Tom Moore calls him, killed himself in a fit of melancholy produced by overwork joined to the loss of his wife, a simple, gay, unlearned woman. Sir Samuel was a stern, reserved man, and she was the only person in the world to whom he could unbosom himself. When he lost her, he said, the very vent of his heart was stopped up. It was in Old Square, Lincoln's Inn, that Benjamin Disraeli, born in December 1805, much too erratic for Plowden and Coke, used to come to study conveyancing at the chambers of Mr. Basevi. He is described as often arriving with Spenser's Faery Queen under his arm, stopping an hour or two to read, and then leaving. This led, as might be expected, not to the Woolsack, but to the authorship of Coningsby. His premiership and his patent of peerage as Lord Beaconsfield are due to other causes. Whetstone Park, now a small quiet passage, full of printing offices and stables, between Great Turnstile and Gate Street, derived its name from a vestryman of the time of Charles I. It is now chiefly occupied by mews, but was once filled by infamous houses and low brandy shops. In 1671, the Duke of Monmouth, the Duke of Grafton, and the Duke of St. Albans, three of King Charles II's illegitimate sons, killed here a beadle in a drunken brawl. A street ballad was written on the occasion, more full of spite against the corrupt court than of sympathy with the slain man. In Poor Doggerel, the Catnach of 1671 describes the watch coming in, disturbed from sleep, to appease their graces. Straight rose mortal jars twixt the night blackguard and the silver stars. Then fell the beadle by a ducal hand, for daring to pronounce the saucy stand. Sadly enough, the silly fellow's death led to a dance at Whitehall being put off. Disappoints the Queen, poor little chuck. and all the brisk courtiers in their gay coats bought with the nation's subsidies. The last two lines are vigorous, sarcastic, and worthy of a humble imitator of Dryden. The poet sums up, "Yet shall Whitehall, the innocent and good, see these men dance, all daubed with lace and blood." In 1682, the misnamed park grew so infamous that a countryman, having been decoyed into one of the houses and robbed, went into Smithfield and collected an angry mob of about 500 apprentices, who marched on Whetstone Park, broke open the houses, and destroyed the furniture. The constables and watchmen, being outnumbered, sent for the King's Guard, who dispersed them and took 11 of them. Nevertheless, the next night another mob stormed the place, again broke in the doors, smashed the windows, and cut the feather beds to pieces. Lincoln's Inn Fields formed part of the ancient Fickett's Fields, a plot of ground of about 10 acres, extending formerly from Bell Yard to Portugal Street and Carey Street. It seems to have been used in the Middle Ages for jousts and tournaments by the Templars and Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, to the priory of which last order it belonged till Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, when it was granted to Anthony Stringer. In an inquest of the time of James I, it is described as having 2 gates for horses and carriages at the east end, one gate leading into Chancery Lane, the other gate at the western end. Queen Elizabeth, afraid that London was growing unwieldy, issued several proclamations against further building. James I, still more timid and conservative, and not thoroughly acquainted with his own capital, issued a like absurd ukase in 1612, by the desire of the benchers and students of Lincoln's Inn, forbidding the erection of new houses in these fields. But no royal edict can prevent a demand for creating a supply, and as the building still went on, a commission was appointed in 1618 to lay out the square in a regular plan. Bacon, then Lord Chancellor, and many noblemen, judges, and masters in Chancery were on this commission, and Inigo Jones, the king's surveyor general, drew up the scheme. The report of this body, given by Rymer, sets out that in the last 16 years there had been more building near and about the city of London than in ages before, and that as these fields were much surrounded by the dwellings and lodgings of noblemen and gentlemen of quality, all small cottages and closes shall be paid for and removed, and the square shall be reduced, both for sweetness, uniformity, and comeliness as an ornament to the city, and for the health and recreation of the inhabitants, into walks and partitions, as Mr. Inigo Jones should in his map devise. There is a tradition that the area of the square, according to Inigo Jones's plan, was to have been made the exact dimensions of the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza. The tradition is probably true, for the area of the pyramid is 535,824 square feet, and that of Lincoln's Inn Fields 550,000. The height of the pyramid was 756 feet. The plan proved too costly, and the subscriptions began probably to fail, but in the course of time noblemen and others began to build for themselves, but without much regard to uniformity. The elevation of Inigo's plan for the fields, painted in oil colours, is still preserved at Wilton House, near Salisbury. The view is taken from the south, and the principal feature in the elevation is Lindsay House in the centre of the west side, whose stone façade, still existing, stands boldly out from the brick houses which support it on either side. The internal accommodation of Lindsay House was never good. These fields in Charles I.'s time became the haunt of wrestlers, bowlers, beggars, and idle boys, and here, in 1624, Lilly the astrologer, then servant to a mantua maker in the Strand, spent his time in bowling with Wat the cobbler, Dick the blacksmith, and such idle apprentices. Hither, after the Restoration, came every sort of villain, the rufflers or maimed soldiers who told lies of Edgehill and Naseby, and who surrounded the coaches of charitable lords, dommerers or sham dumb men, mumpers or sham broken gentlemen, whipjacks or sham seamen with bound-up legs, abram-men or sham idiots, freighters or rogues with forged patents, anglers, wild rogues, clapperdudgeons, and men with gambling wheels of fortune. In Queen Anne's reign, Gay sketches the dangers of night in these fields. He warns his readers to avoid the lurking thief, by day a beggar, or else "the crutch which late compassion moved shall wound thy bleeding head and fell thee to the ground." Nor trust the linkman, he adds, along the lonely wall, or he'll put out his light and rob you, but still keep the public streets where oily rays that from the crystal lamp o'erspread the ways. The south side of Lincoln's Inn Fields was built and named 3 years before the Restoration by Sir William Cowper, James Cowper, and Robert Henley. In 1668, Portugal Row, as it was called, but not from Charles's queen, was extremely fashionable. There was then living here such noble and noted persons as Lady Arden, William Perpoint, Esquire, Sir Charles Waldegrave, Lady Fitzharding, Lady Diana Curzon, Sergeant Maynard, Lord Cardigan, Mrs. Anne Heron, Lady Mordaunt, Richard Adams, Esquire, Lady Carr, Lady Wentworth, Mr. Attorney Montague, Lady Coventry, Judge Welch, and Lady Davenant. Mr. Sergeant Maynard was the brave old Presbyterian lawyer, then 87, who replied to the Prince of Orange, when he said that he must have outlived all the men of law of his time, "Sir, I should have outlived the law itself had not your Highness come over." Lady Davenant was the widow of Sir William Davenant, the Oxford innkeeper's son, the poet and manager who, aided by Whitlock and Maynard, was allowed in Cromwell's time to perform operas at a theatre in Charterhouse Square. After the Restoration, he had the theatre in Portugal Street. He died in 1668, insolvent. His poems were published by his widow and dedicated to the Duke of York in 1673. Lord Cardigan was the father of the infamous Countess of Shrewsbury, who is said, disguised as a page, to have held her lover, the Duke of Buckingham's horse, while he killed her husband in a duel near Barn Elms. The Earl of Rochester lived in the house next the Duke's Theatre, which stood behind the present College of Surgeons, as Davenant says in one of his epilogues, "The prospect of the sea cannot be shown, therefore be pleased to think that you are all behind the row which men call Portugal." In September 1586, Ballard, Babington, and other conspirators against the life of Queen Elizabeth were put to death in Lincoln's Inn Fields. Babington was a young man of good family, who had been a page to the Earl of Shrewsbury, and had plotted to rescue Mary and assassinate Elizabeth. His plot discovered, he had fled to St. John's Wood for concealment. 7 of these plotters were hanged on the first day, and 7 on the second. The last 7 were allowed to die, by special grace, before being disembowelled by the executioner. It was through these fields that, one spring night in 1676–7, Thomas Sadler, an impudent and well-known thief, rivalling the audacity of Blood, having with some confederates stolen the mace and purse of Lord Chancellor Finch from his house in Great Queen Street, bore them in mock procession on their way to their lodgings in Knightrider Street, Doctors' Commons. Sadler was hanged at Tyburn for this theft. Lord William Russell was son of William, Earl of Bedford, by Lady Anne Carr, daughter of Carr, Earl of Somerset. He was beheaded in the centre of Lincoln's Inn Fields, July 21, 1683, the last year but 2 of the reign of King Charles II, for being, as it was alleged, engaged in a plot to attack the guards and kill the king, on his return from Newmarket races at the Rye House Farm, in a by-road near Hoddesdon, in Hertfordshire, about 17 miles northeast of London. End of Chapter 14, Part 1. Recording by Linda Johnson. Chapter 14, Part 2 of Haunted London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Haunted London by Walter Thornbury. Chapter 14. Lincoln's Inn Fields, Part 2. The Whig party, in their eagerness to restrain the Papists and exclude the Duke of York from the throne, had gone too far, and their zeal for the Dissenters had produced a violent reaction in the High Church party. Charles and the Duke, taking advantage of the return tide, began to persecute the Dissenters, denounce Shaftesbury, assail the liberties of the city, and finally dissolved the Parliament. Soon after this, that subtle politician Shaftesbury, finding it impossible to rouse the Duke of Monmouth, Essex, or Lord Russell, denounced them all as sold and deceived, and fled to Holland. After his flight, meetings of his creatures were held at the chambers of one West, an active talking man. Keeling, a vintner of decaying business, betrayed the plot, as also did Lord Howard, a man so infamous that Charles himself said he would not hang the worst dog he had upon his evidence. Keeling and his brother swore that 40 men were hired to intercept the king, but that a fire at Newmarket, which had hastened Charles's return, had defeated their plans. Goodenough, an ex-sheriff, had told them that the Duke of Monmouth and other great men were to raise 4,000 soldiers and £20,000. The brothers also swore that Goodenough had told them that Lord Russell had joined in the design of killing the king and the Duke. Lord Russell acted with great composure. He would not fly, refused to let his friends surrender themselves to share his fortunes, and told an acquaintance that he was very sensible he should fall a sacrifice. When he appeared at the council, the king himself said that nobody suspected Lord Russell of any design against his own person, but that he had good evidence of his being in designs against his government. The prisoner denied all knowledge of the intended insurrection, or of the attempt to surprise the guards. The infamous Jeffreys was one of the counsel for his prosecution. Lord Russell argued at his trial that, allowing he had compassed the king's death, which he denied, he had been guilty only of a conspiracy to levy war, which was not treason except by a recent statute of Charles II, the prosecutions upon which were limited to a certain time which had elapsed, so that both law and justice were in this case violated. The truth seems to be that Lord Russell was a true patriot, of a slow and sober judgment, a taciturn, good man, of not the quickest intelligence, who had allowed himself to listen to dangerous and random talk for the sake of political purposes. He wished to debar the Duke from the throne, but he had never dreamt of accomplishing his purpose by murder. It has since been discovered that Sidney, doing evil that good might come, had accepted Secret Service money from France, and that Russell himself had interviews with French agents. Lord John Russell explains away this charge very well. Charles was degraded enough to take money from France. The patriots, told that Louis XIV wished to avoid a war, intrigued with the French king to maintain peace, fearing that if Charles once raised an army under any pretence, he would first employ it to obtain absolute power at home, which it is most probable he would have done. On the whole, these disingenuous interviews must be lamented. They could not and they did not lead to good. It has been justly regretted also that Lord Russell on his trial did not boldly denounce the tyranny of the court, and show the necessity that had existed for active opposition. After sentence, the condemned man wrote petitions to the king and duke, which were unjustly sneered at as abject. They really, however, contain no promise but that of living beyond sea, and meddling no more in English affairs. Of one of them, at least, Burnet says it was written at the earnest solicitation of Lady Rachel, and Lord Russell himself said, with regret, "This will be printed and sold about the streets as my submission when I am led out to be hanged." He lamented to Burnet that his wife beat every bush, and ran about so for his preservation. But he acquiesced in what she did when he thought it would be afterwards a mitigation of her sorrow. When his brave and excellent wife, the daughter of Charles I.'s loyal servant Southampton, who was the son of Shakespeare's friend, begged for her husband's life, the king replied, "How can I grant that man 6 weeks, who would not have granted me 6 hours?" "There is no scene in history that goes more directly to the heart," says Fox, "than the story of the last days of this excellent man. The night before his death it rained hard, and he said, 'Such a rain to-morrow will spoil a great show,' which was a dull thing on a rainy day. He thought a violent death only the pain of a minute, not equal to that of drawing a tooth, and he was still of opinion that the king was limited by law, and that when he broke through those limits, his subjects might defend themselves and restrain him. He then received the sacrament from Tillotson with much devotion, and parted from his wife with a composed silence. As soon as she was gone, he exclaimed, 'The bitterness of death is past,' saying what a blessing she had been to him, and what a misery it had been if she had tried to induce him to turn an informer. He slept soundly that night, and rose in a few hours, but would take no care in dressing. He prayed 6 or 7 times by himself, and drank a little tea and some sherry. He then wound up his watch and said, 'Now I have done with time, and shall go into eternity.' When told that he should give the executioner 10 guineas, he said with a smile that it was a pretty thing to give a fee to have his head cut off. When the sheriffs came at 10 o'clock, Lord Russell embraced Lord Cavendish, who had offered to change clothes with him and stay in his place in prison, or to attack the coach with a troop of horse and carry off his friend, but the noble man would not listen to either proposal. In the street, some in the crowd wept, while others insulted him. He said, 'I hope I shall quickly see a better assembly.' He then sang, half to himself, the beginning of the 149th Psalm. As the coach turned into Little Queen Street, he said, looking at his own house, 'I have often turned to the one hand with great comfort, but now I turn to this with greater,' and then a tear or two fell from his eyes. As they entered Lincoln's Inn Fields, he said, 'This has been to me a place of sinning, and God now makes it the place of my punishment.' When he came to the scaffold, he walked about it 4 or 5 times. Then he prayed by himself, and also with Tillotson. Then he partly undressed himself, laid his head down without any change of countenance, and it was cut off in 2 strokes. Lord William's walking stick, and a contemporary account of his death, are kept at Woburn Abbey. Lady Rachel Russell, the excellent wife of this patriot, had been his secretary during the trial. She spent her afterlife not in unwisely lamenting the inevitable past, but in doing good works and in educating her children. Writing 2 months after the execution to Dr. Fitzwilliams, this noble woman says, "Secretly my heart mourns and cannot be comforted, because I have not the dear companion and sharer of all my joys and sorrows. I want him to talk with, to walk with, to eat and sleep with. All these things are irksome to me now. All company and meals I could avoid, if it might be. When I see my children before me, I remember the pleasure he took in them. This makes my heart shrink." In 1692, Lady Russell appears to have regained her composure. But she had other trials in store, for in 1711 she lost her only son, the Duke of Bedford, in the flower of his age, and 6 months afterwards one of her daughters died in childbed. It is said that in his hour of need James II. Was mean enough to say to the Duke of Bedford, "My lord, you are an honest man, have great credit, and can do me signal service." "Ah, sir," replied the Duke with a grave severity, "I am old and feeble now, but I once had a son." The Sacheverell riots culminated in these now quiet fields. In 1710, Daniel Domery, a Queen's waterman, Francis Willis, a footman, and George Purchas were tried at the Old Bailey for heading a riot during the Sacheverell trial and pulling down meeting-houses. This Sacheverell was an ignorant, impudent incendiary, the adopted son of a Marlborough apothecary, and was impeached by the House of Commons for preaching at St. Andrew's, Holborn, sermons denouncing the Revolution of 1688. His sermons were ordered to be burnt, and he was sentenced to be suspended for 3 years. Atterbury helped the mischievous Firebrand in his ineffectual defence, and Swift wrote a most scurrilous letter to Bishop Fleetwood, who had lamented the excesses of the mob. Sacheverell had been at Oxford with Addison, who inscribed a poem to him. During the trial, a mob marched from the Temple, whither they had escorted Sacheverell, pulled down Dr. Burgess's meeting-house, and threw the pulpit, sconces, and gallery pews into a fire in Lincoln's Inn Fields, some waving curtains on poles, shouting, "High Church standard! Huzzah, High Church and Sacheverell! We will have them all down." They also burnt other meeting-houses in Leather Lane, Drury Lane, and Fetter Lane, and made bonfires of the woodwork in the streets. They were eventually dispersed by the Horse Grenadiers and Horse Guards and foot. Domery was sentenced to death, but pardoned. Willis was acquitted, and Purchas was pardoned. Wooden posts and rails stood round the fields till 1735, when an act was passed to enable the inhabitants to make improvements, to put an iron gate at each corner, and to erect dwarf walls and iron palisades. Before this time, grooms used to break in horses on this spot. One day, while looking at these centaurs, Sir Joseph Jekyll, who had brought a very obnoxious bill into Parliament in 1736 in order to raise the price of gin, was mobbed, thrown down, and dangerously trampled on. His initials, J.J., figure under a gibbet chalked on a wall in one of Hogarth's prints. Macaulay's History contains a very highly coloured picture of these fields. A comparison of the passage with the facts from which it is drawn would be a useful lesson to all historical students who love truth in its severity. Newcastle House stands at the northwest angle of the fields, at the southeastern corner of Great Queen Street. It derived its name from John Hollis, Duke of Newcastle, a relative of the noble families of Vere, Cavendish, and Hollis. This duke bought the house before 1708, but died in 1711 without issue, and was succeeded in the house by his nephew, the leader of the Pelham administration under George II. The house had been bought by Lord Powis about 1686. It was built for him by Captain William Winde, a scholar of Webb's, the pupil and executor of Inigo Jones. William Herbert, first Marquis of Powis, was outlawed and fled to Saint Germain's to James II, who made him Duke of Powis. Government had thought of buying the house when it was inhabited by the Lord Keeper, Sir Nathan Wright, and to have settled it officially on the Great Seal. It was once the residence of Sir John Somers, the Lord Chancellor. In 1739, Lady Henrietta Herbert, widow of Lord William Herbert, second son of the Marquis of Powis and daughter of James, 1st Earl of Waldegrave, was married to Mr. John Beard, who seems to have been a fine singer and a most charitable, estimable man. Lady Henrietta's grandmother was the daughter of James II by the sister of the great Duke of Marlborough. Dr. Burner speaks of Beard's great knowledge of music and of his intelligence as an actor. In an epitaph on him, still extant, the writer says, "Whence had that voice such magic to control? 'Twas but the echo of a well-tuned soul. Through life his morals and his music ran in symphony, and spoke the virtuous man. Go, gentle harmonist, our hopes approve, to meet and hear thy sacred songs above. When taught by thee, the stage of life well trod, we rise to raptures round the throne of God." Beard, excellent both in oratorios and serious and comic operas, became part proprietor of Covent Garden Theatre, and died in 1791. The Duke of Newcastle's crowded levees were his pleasure and his triumph. He generally made people of business wait 2 or 3 hours in the antechamber, while he trifled with insignificant favourites in his closet. When at last he entered the levee room, he accosted, hugged, embraced, and promised everything to everybody, with an assumed cordiality and a degrading familiarity. Long Sir Thomas Robertson was a great intruder on the Duke's time. If told that he was out, he would come in to look at the clock or play with the monkey, in hopes of the great man relenting. The servants, at last tired out with Sir Thomas, concocted a formula of repulses, and the next time he came, the porter, without waiting for his question, began, "Sir, his grace is gone out, the fire has gone out, the clock stands, and the monkey is dead." Sir Timothy Waldo, on his way from the Duke's dinner-table to his own carriage, once gave the cook, who was waiting in the hall, a crown. The rogue returned it, saying he did not take silver. "Oh, don't you indeed?" said Sir Timothy, coolly replacing it in his pocket. "Then I don't give gold." Jonas Hanway, the great opponent of tea-drinking, published 8 letters to the Duke on this subject, and the custom began from that time to decline, but Hogarth had already condemned the exaction. The Duke was very profuse in his promises, and a good story is told of the result of his insincerity. At a Cornish election, the Duke had obtained the turning vote for his candidate by his usual assurances. The elector, wishing to secure something definite, had asked for a supervisorship of excise for his son-in-law on the present holder's death. "The moment he dies," said the Premier, "set out post-haste for London, drive directly to my house in the Fields. Night or day, sleeping or waking, dead or alive, thunder at the door. The porter will show you upstairs directly, and the place is yours." A few months after, the old supervisor died, and up to London rushed the Cornish elector. Now, that very night the Duke had been expecting news of the death of the King of Spain, and had left orders before he went to bed to have the courier sent up directly he arrived. The Cornish man, mistaken for this important messenger, was instantly, to his great delight, shown up to the Duke's bedroom. "Is he dead? Is he dead?" cried the Duke. "Yes, my lord, yes," answered the aspirant promptly. "When did he die?" "The day before yesterday, at 1:30, after 3 weeks in his bed, and taking a power of doctor's stuff. And I hope your grace will be as good as your word, and let my son-in-law succeed him." "Succeed him!" shouted the Duke. "Is the man drunk or mad? Where are your dispatches?" he exclaimed, tearing back the bed-curtains, and there, to his vexation, stood the blundering elector, hat in hand, his stupid red face beaming with smiles as he kept bowing like a joss. The Duke sank back in a violent fit of laughter, which, like the electric fluid, was in a moment communicated to his attendants. It is not stated whether the Cornish man obtained his petition. There is an agreement in all the stories of the Duke, who was 30 years Secretary of State, and nearly 10 years First Lord of the Treasury, whether told, says Macaulay, by people who were perpetually seeing him in Parliament and attending his levees in Lincoln's Inn Fields, or by Grub Street writers, who had never more than a glimpse of his star through the windows of his gilded coach. Smollett and Walpole mixed in different society, yet they both sketch the Duke with the same colours. Smollett's Newcastle runs out of his dressing-room with his face covered with soap-suds to embrace the Moorish envoy. Walpole's Newcastle pushes his way into the Duke of Grafton's sick-room to kiss the old nobleman's plasters. He was a living, moving, talking caricature. His gait was a shuffling trot, his utterance a rapid stutter. He was always in a hurry, he was never in time. He abounded in fulsome caresses and in hysterical tears. His oratory resembled that of Justice Shallow. It was nonsense effervescent with animal spirits and impertinence. Oh, yes, yes, to be sure, Annapolis must be defended. Troops must be sent to Annapolis. Pray, where is Annapolis? Cape Breton an island! Wonderful! Show it me on the map. So it is, sure enough. My dear sir, you always bring us good news. I must go and tell the king that Cape Breton is an island. His success is a proof of what may be done by a man who devotes his whole heart and soul to one object. His love of power was so intense a passion that it almost supplied the place of talent. He was jealous even of his own brother. Under the guise of levity, he was false beyond all example. All the able men of his time ridiculed him as a dunce, a driveller, a child, who never knew his own mind for an hour together, and yet he overreached them all round. If the country had remained at peace, this man might have been at the head of affairs till a new king came with fresh favourites and a strong will. But the inauspicious commencement of the 7 Years' War brought on a crisis to which Newcastle was altogether unequal. After a calm of 15 years, the spirit of the nation was again stirred to its inmost depths. This is strongly etched, but Macaulay was too fond of caricature for a real lover of truth. Walpole, recounting this greedy imbecile's disgrace, reviews his career much more forcibly, for in a few words he shows us how great had been the power which this chatterer's fixed purpose had attained. The memoir writer describes the Duke as the man who had begun the world by heading mobs against the ministers of Queen Anne, who had braved the heir apparent, afterwards George I, and forced himself upon him as godfather to his son, who had recovered that prince's favour, and preserved power under him at the expense of every minister whom that prince preferred, who had been a rival of another Prince of Wales for the chancellorship of Cambridge, and who was now buffeted from a fourth court by a very suitable competitor, Lord Bute, and reduced in his tottery old age to have recourse to those mobs and that popularity which had raised him 50 years before. Lord Bute was mean enough to compliment the old Duke on his retirement. The Duke replied with a spirit that showed the vitality of his ambition, "Yes, yes, my lord, I am an old man, but yesterday was my birthday, and I recollected that Cardinal Fleury began to be Prime Minister of France just at my age." Newcastle House, now occupied by the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, was for 40 years or more inhabited by Sir Alan Chamber, one of King George III's judges. The Society, then lodged in Bartlett's Buildings in Holborn, derived its first name from that place, and at Sir Alan's death they purchased the house and site. About the centre of the west side of the square in Sir Alan's time lived the Earl and Countess of Portsmouth. The Earl was half-witted, but was always well conducted and quite producible in society under the guidance of his Countess, a daughter of Lord Grantley. Near Surgeons' Hall at the same epoch lived the first Lord Winford, Lord Chief Justice of the Common Pleas, better known as Sergeant Best. A quarrel between this irritable lawyer and Sergeant Wilde, afterwards Lord Chancellor Truro, one of the most stalwart gladiators who ever won a name and title in the legal arena, gave rise to an epigram, the point of which was, that Best was wild and wild was best. In 1774, when Lord Clive had rewarded Wedderburn, his defender, with lakhs of rupees and a villa at Mitcham, the lawyer had an elegant house in Lincoln's Inn Fields, not far from the Duke of Newcastle's, a quarter, says Lord Campbell, which I recollect still the envied resort of legal magnates. Wedderburn, afterwards better known as Lord Chancellor Loughborough, had a special hatred for Franklin, and loaded him with abuse before a committee of the Privy Council, for having sent to America letters from the Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, urging the government to employ military forces to suppress the discontents in New England. The effect of Wedderburn's brilliant oratory in Parliament was ruined, says Lord Campbell, by his character for insincerity. When George III heard of his death, he is reported to have said, "He has not left a greater knave behind him in my dominions," upon which Lord Thurlow savagely said with his usual oath, "I perceive that his Majesty is quite sane at present." Wedderburn was a friend of David Hume. His humanity was eulogized by Dr. Parr, but he was satirized by Churchill in the Rosciad. Montague, Earl of Sandwich, the great patron of Pepys, lived in Lincoln's Inn Fields, paying £250 a year rent. Pepys calls it a fine house but deadly dear. He visits him February 10, 1663-4, and finds my lord very high and strange and stately, although Pepys had been bound for £1,000 with him, and the shrewd cit naturally enough did not like my lord being angry with him and in debt to him at the same time. The Earl was a distant cousin of Pepys, and on his marriage received him and his wife into his house, and took Pepys with him when he went to bring home Charles II, when he was elected one of the Council of State and General at Sea. He brought the Queen Mother to England, and took her back again. He also brought the ill-fated Queen from Portugal, and became a privy councillor, and was sent as ambassador to Spain. He seems to have been not untainted with the vices of the age. He was in the great battle where Von Trump was killed, and in 1668 he took 45 sail from the Dutch at sea, and that is the best thing known of him. He died in 1672, and was buried in great state. Inigo Jones built only the west side of the square. Number 55 was the residence of Robert Bertie, Earl of Lindsey, a general of King Charles. It is described in 1708 as a handsome building of the Ionic order, with a beautiful and strong court gate, formed of 6 spacious brick piers, with curious ironwork between them, and on the piers large and beautiful vases. The open balustrade at the top bore 6 urns. The Earl of Lindsey was shot at Edgehill in 1642, when a reckless and intemperate charge of Rupert had led to the total defeat of the unsupported foot. His son, Lord Willoughby, was taken in endeavouring to rescue his father. Clarendon describes the Earl as a lavish, generous, yet punctilious man, of great honour and experience in foreign war. He was surrounded by Lincolnshire gentlemen, who served in his regiment out of personal regard for him. He was jealous of Prince Rupert's interference, and had made up his mind to die. As he lay bleeding to death, he reproved the officers of the Earl of Essex, many of them his old friends, for their ingratitude and foul rebellion. The 4th Earl of Lindsey was created Duke of Ancaster, and the house henceforward bore that now forgotten name. It was subsequently sold to the proud Duke of Somerset, the same who married the widow of the Mr. Thynne whom Count Königsmarck murdered. In the early part of George III's reign, Lindsey House became a sort of lodging-house for foreign members of the Moravian persuasion. The staircase, about 1772, was painted with scenes from the history of the Herrnhuthers. The most conspicuous figures were those of a negro catechumen in a white shirt, and a missionary who went over to Algiers to preach to the galley slaves, and died in Africa of the plague. There was also a painting of a Moravian clergyman being saved from a desert rock on which he had been cast. Repeated mention of the Berties is made in Horace Walpole's pleasant Letters. Lord Robert Bertie was 3rd son of Robert, the 1st Duke of Ancaster and Kesteven. He was a general in the army, a colonel in the Guards, and a lord of the bedchamber. He married Lady Raymond in 1762, and died in 1782. The proud Duke of Somerset, in 1748, left to his eldest daughter, Lady Frances, married to the Marquis of Granby, 3,000 a year, and the fine house built by Inigo Jones in Lincoln's Inn Fields, which he had bought of the Duke of Ancaster for the Duchess, hoping that his daughter would let her mother live with her. In July 1779, the Duke of Ancaster, dying of drinking and rioting at 22, recalls much scandal to Walpole's mind. He had been in love with Lady Honoria, Walpole's niece, but Horace does not regret the match dropping through, for he says the Duke was of a turbulent nature, and, though of a fine figure, not noble in manners. Lady Priscilla Elizabeth Bertie, eldest sister of the Duke, married the grandson of Peter Burrell, a merchant, who became husband of the Lady Great Chamberlain of England, and inherited a barony and half the Ancaster estate. The 3 last duchesses, goes on the cruel gossip, were never sober. The present Duchess Dowager, he adds, was natural daughter of Panton, a disreputable horse-jockey of Newmarket. The other duchess was some lady's woman or young lady's governess. Mr. Burrell's daughters married Lord Percy and the Duke of Hamilton. In 1791, Walpole writes to Miss Berry to describe the marriage of Lord Cholmondeley with Lady Georgiana Charlotte Bertie. The men were in frocks and white waistcoats. The endowing purse, I believe, has been left off ever since broad pieces were called in and melted down. We were but 18 persons in all. The poor Duchess mother wept excessively. She is now left quite alone, her 2 daughters married, and her other children dead. She herself, I fear, is in a very dangerous way. She goes directly to Spa, where the new married pair are to meet her. We all separated in an hour and a half. Alfred Tennyson, in early life, had fourth-floor chambers at number 55, and there probably his friend Hallam, whose early death he laments in his In Memoriam, spent many an hour with him. There, in the airy regions of Attica, in a low-roofed room, the single window of which is darkened by a huge stone balustrade, a gloomy relic of past grandeur, the young poet may have recited the majestic lines of his King Arthur, or the exquisite lament of Mariana, and there he may have immortalized the plump head-waiter of the Cock in Fleet Street. Mr. John Foster, the author of many sound and delightful historical biographies, had also chambers in this house. Number 68, on the west side, stands on the site of the approach to the stables of old Newcastle House. Here Judge Leblanc lived, and at his death the house was occupied by Mr. Thomas Leblanc, Master of Trinity Hall, Cambridge. At number 33, on the same side as the Insolvent Debtors' Court, dwelt Judge Park, a man much beloved by his friends. In his early days, as a young and poor Scotch barrister, he had lived in Carey Street till his house there was burnt down. He used to say that his great ambition in youth had been to one day live at number 33 in the Fields, at that time occupied by Chief Justice Willis, but in later days, as a judge, leaving the former goal of his ambition, he migrated to Bedford Square, where he died. Numbers 40 and 42 on the south side form the Museum of the College of Surgeons, incorporated in 1800. The Grecian front is a most clever contrivance by Sir John Soane. The building contains the incomparable anatomical collection of the eminent John Hunter, bought by the government for £15,000, and given to the College of Surgeons on condition of its being opened to the public. John Hunter died in 1793, and the first courses of lectures in the new building were delivered by Sir Everard Home and Sir William Blizzard in 1810. The museum was built by Barry in 1835 and cost about £40,000. It is divided into two rooms, the normal and abnormal. The total number of specimens is upwards of 23,000. The collection is unequalled in many respects. Every article is authentic and in perfect preservation. The largest human skeleton is that of Charles O'Brien, the Irish giant, who died in Cockspur Street, Charing Cross, in 1783, aged 22. It measures 8 feet 4 inches. By its side, in ghastly contrast, is the bony sketch of Caroline Cratchemy, a Sicilian dwarf, who died in 1824, aged 10 years. There is also a cast of the hand of Patrick Cotter, another Irish giant, who measured 8 feet 7½ inches. Nor must we overlook the vast framework of Chunee, the elephant that went mad with toothache at Exeter Change, and was shot by a company of riflemen in 1826. The sawn base of the inflamed tusk shows a spicula of ivory pressing into the nervous pulp. Toothache is always terrible, but only imagine a square foot of it. Very curious, too, are the jaw of the extinct saber-toothed tiger and the skeleton of a gigantic extinct Irish deer found under a bed of shell marl in a peat bog near Limerick. The antlers are 7 feet long, 8 feet across, and weigh 76 pounds. The height of the animal, measured from his skull, was 7 feet 6 inches. Amongst other horrors, there is a cast of the fleshy band that united the Siamese twins, and one of a woman with a long curved horn growing from her forehead. There are also many skulls of soldiers perforated and torn with bullets, the lead still adhering to some of the bony plates of the crania. But the wonder of wonders is the iron pivot of a trysail mast that was driven clean through the chest of a Scarborough lad. The boy recovered in 5 months, and not long after went to work again. It is a tough race that rules the sea. There are also fragments of the skeleton of a rhinoceros discovered in a limestone cavern at Orriston during the formation of the Plymouth breakwater. In a recess from the gallery stands the embalmed body of the wife of Martin van Buchel, an impudent Dutch quack doctor. It is coarsely preserved, and is very loathsome to look at. It was prepared in 1775 by Dr. W. Hunter and Mr. Cruikshank, the vascular system being injected with oil of turpentine and camphorated spirits of wine, and powdered nitre and camphor being introduced into the cavities. On the case containing the body is an advertisement cut from an old newspaper, stating the conditions which Dr. Van Buchel required of those who came to see the body of his wife. At the feet of Mrs. Van Buchel is the shrunken mummy of her pet parrot. The pictures include the portrait of John Hunter by Reynolds, which Sharp engraved. It has much faded. There is also a posthumous bust of Hunter by Flaxman, and one of Clive by Chantrey. Any fellow of the college can introduce a visitor, either personally or by written order, the first 4 days of the week. In September the museum is closed. It would be much more convenient for students if some small sum were charged for admission. It is now visited but by 2 or 3 people a day, when it should be inspected by hundreds. That great surgeon, John Hunter, was the son of a small farmer in Lanarkshire. He was born in 1728 and died in 1793. In early life he went abroad as an army surgeon to study gunshot wounds, and in 1786 he was appointed Deputy Surgeon General to the army. In 1772 he made discoveries as to the property of the gastric juice. He was the first to use cutting as a cure for hydrophobia, and to distinguish the various species of cancer. He kept at his house at Brompton a variety of wild animals for the purposes of comparative anatomy, was often in danger from their violence, and as often saved by his own intrepidity. Sir Joseph Banks divided his collection between Hunter and the British Museum. Unequalled in the dissecting room, Hunter was a bad lecturer. He was an irritable man, and died suddenly during a disputation at St. George's Hospital, which vexed him. His death is said to have been hastened by fear of death from hydrophobia, he having cut his hand while dissecting a man who had died of that mysterious disease. Hunter used to call an operation opprobrium medici. In Portugal Row, as the southern side of the square used to be called, lived Sir Richard Fanshawe, the translator of the Lusiad of Camoens and of Guarini's Pastor Fido. Sir Richard was our ambassador in Spain, but Charles, wishing to get rid of Lord Sandwich from the navy, recalled Fanshawe on the plea that he had ventured to sign a treaty without authority. He died in 1666, on the intended day of his return, of a violent fever, probably caused by vexation at his unmerited disgrace. Sir Richard appears to have been a religious, faithful man, and a good scholar, but born in unhappy times and to an ill fate. Charles I had very justly a great respect for him. His wife was a brave, determined woman, full of affection, good sense, and equally full of hatred and contempt for Lord Sandwich, Pepys's friend, who had supplanted her husband in the embassy. On one occasion, on their way to Malaga, the Dutch trading vessel in which she and her husband were was threatened by a Turkish galley which bore down on them in full sail. The captain, who had rendered his 60 guns useless by lumbering them up with cargo, resolved to fight for his £30,000 worth of goods, and therefore armed his 200 men and plied them with brandy. The decks were partially cleared, and the women ordered below for fear the Turks might think the vessel a merchant ship and board it. Sir Richard, taking his gun, bandolier, and sword, stood with the ship's company, waiting for the Turks. But we must quote the brave wife's own simple words. "The beast, the captain, had locked me up in the cabin. I knocked and called long to no purpose, until at length the cabin boy came and opened the door. I, all in tears, desired him to be so good as to give me the blue thrum cap he wore, and his tarred coat, which he did, and I gave him half a crown, and putting them on and flinging away my night clothes, I crept up softly and stood upon the deck by my husband's side, as free from fear as, I confess, from discretion. But it was the effect of that passion which I could never master. By this time the two vessels were engaged in parley, and so well satisfied with speech and sight of each other's forces, that the Turks' man-of-war tacked about, and we continued our course. But when your father saw me retreat, looking upon me, he blessed himself and snatched me up in his arms, saying, 'Good God, that love can make this change!' And though he seemingly chid me, he would laugh at it as often as he remembered that journey." This same vessel, a short time after, was blown up in the harbor, with the loss of more than 100 men and all the lading. This brave good woman showed still greater fortitude when her husband died and left her almost penniless in a strange country. She had only 28 doubloons with which to bring home her children and 60 servants and the dead body of her husband. She, however, instantly sold her carriages and 1,000 pounds worth of plate, and setting apart the Queen's present of 2,000 doubloons for travelling expenses, started for England. "God," she says in her brave, pious way, "did hear and see and help me, and brought my soul out of trouble." In 1677, Lady Fanshawe took a house in Holborn Row, the north side of the square, and spent a year lamenting the dear remembrances of her past happiness and fortune, and though she had great graces and favours from the king and queen and whole court, yet she found at the present no remedy. Lord Kenyon lived at No. 35 in 1805. Jekyll was fond of joking about Kenyon's stinginess, and used to say he died of eating apple pie crust at breakfast to save the expense of muffins, and that Lord Ellenborough, who succeeded on Kenyon's death to the Chief Justiceship, always used to bow to apple pie ever afterwards, which Jekyll called his apple piety. The Princesses Augusta and Sophia once told Tom Moore, at Lady Donegal's, that the king used to play tricks on Kenyon, and send the dispatch box to him at 7:15, when it was known the learned lord was in bed to save candlelight. Lord Ellenborough used to say that the final word in Mors Janua Vitae was misspelled vita on Kenyon's tomb to save the extra cost of the diphthong. George III used to say to Kenyon, "My lord, let us have a little more of your good law, and less of your bad Latin." Lord Campbell, who gives a very pleasant sketch of Chief Justice Kenyon, with his bad temper and bad Latin, his hatred of newspaper writers and gamblers, and his wrath against pettifoggers, describes his being taken in by Horne Tooke, and laughs at his ignorantly mixed metaphors. He seems to have been a respectable second-rate lawyer, conscientious and upright. "He occupied," says Lord Campbell, "a large gloomy house, in which I have seen merry doings when it was afterwards transferred to the Verulam Club." The tradition of this house was that it was always Lent in the kitchen and Passion Week in the parlour. On some one mentioning the spits in Lord Kenyon's kitchen, Jekyll said, "It is irrelevant to talk about the spits, for nothing turns upon them." The judge's ignorance was profound. It is reported that in a trial for blasphemy, the Chief Justice, after citing the names of several remarkable early Christians, said, Above all, gentlemen, need I name to you the Emperor Julian, who was so celebrated for the practice of every Christian virtue that he was called Julian the Apostle? On another occasion, talking of a false witness, he is supposed to have said, "The allegation is as far from truth as old Boterium from the northern main," a line I have heard or met with God knows where. Lord Erskine lived at No. 36 in 1805, the year before he rose at once to the peerage and the woolsack, and presided at Lord Melville's trial. He did not hold the seals many months, and died in 1823. This great Whig orator was the youngest son of the Earl of Buchan. He was a midshipman and an ensign before he became a student at Lincoln's Inn. He began to be known in 1778. In 1781 he defended Lord George Gordon. In 1794 Horne Tooke, Hardy, Thelwall, and afterwards Tom Paine. The house that contains the Soane Museum, No. 13 on the north side, was built in 1812, and, consisting of 24 small apartments crammed with curiosities, is in itself a marvel of fantastic ingenuity. Every inch of space is turned to account. On one side of the picture-room are cabinets, and on the other movable shutters or screens on which pictures are also hung, so that a small area, only 13 feet long and 12 broad, contains as much as a gallery 45 feet long and 20 feet broad. A Roman altar once stood in the outer court. It is a disgrace to the trustees that this curious museum is kept so private, and that such impediments are thrown in the way of visitors. It is open only 2 days a week in April, May, and June, but at certain seasons a third day is granted to foreigners, artists, and people from the country. To obtain tickets you are obliged to get, some days before you visit, a letter from a trustee, or to write to the curator, enter your name in a book, and leave your card. All this vexatious hindrance and fuss has the desired effect of preventing many persons from visiting a museum left not to the trustees or the curator, but to the nation, to every Englishman. In order to read the books, copy the pictures, or examine the plans and drawings, the same tedious and humiliating form must be gone through. End of Chapter 14, Part 2. Recording by Linda Johnson.
Chapter 26, Part 3 of Haunted London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Haunted London by Walter Thornbury. Chapter 26, Part 3. Lincoln's Inn Fields. The gem of all the Soane's treasures is an enormous transparent alabaster sarcophagus, discovered by Belzoni in 1816 in a tomb in the valley of Beban el Muluk, near Thebes. It is 9 feet 4 inches long, 3 feet 8 inches wide, 2 feet 8 inches deep, and is covered without and within with beautifully cut hieroglyphics. It was the greatest discovery of the runaway Paduan monk, and was undoubtedly the cenotaph or sarcophagus of a pharaoh or Ptolemy. It was discovered in an enormous tomb of endless chambers, which the Arabs still call Belzoni's tomb. On the bottom of the case is a full-length figure in relief of Isis, the guardian of the dead. Sir John Soane gave £2,000 for this sarcophagus to Mr. Salt, Consul General of Egypt and Belzoni's employer. The raised lid is broken into 19 pieces. The late Sir Gardner Wilkinson considered this to be the cenotaph of Azerai, the father of Rameses the Great. But the forgotten king, for whom the stone sarcophagus was really executed, was Seti, surnamed Menai-on-Ptah, the father of Rameses the Great. He is called by Manetho Sethos. Dr. Lepsius dates the commencement of his reign B.C. 1439. Dr. Bruch places it 20 years earlier. Mr. Sharp, with that delightful uncertainty characteristic of Egyptian antiquaries, drags the epoch down 200 years later. Seti was the father of the Pharaoh who persecuted the Israelites, and he made war against Syria. His son was the famous Rameses. All three kings were descended from the shepherd chiefs. The most beautiful fragment in Karnak represents this monarch, Seti, in his chariot, with a sword like a fish slice in one hand, while in the other he clutches the top-knots of a group of conquered enemies, Nubian, Syrian, and Jewish. The work is full of an almost Raphaelesque grace. After this come some of Flaxman's and Banks's sketches and models, a cast of the shield of Achilles by the former, and one of the Boothby monument by the latter. There is also a fine collection of ancient gems and intaglios, pure in taste and exquisitely cut, and a set of the Napoleon medals, selected by Denon for the Empress Josephine, and in the finest possible state. We may also mention Sir Christopher Wren's watch, some ivory chairs, and a table from Tipu Saib's devastated palace at Seringapatam, and a richly mounted pistol taken by Peter the Great from a Turkish general at Azov in 1696. The latter was given to Napoleon by the Russian Emperor at the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, and was presented by him to a French officer at St. Helena. The books, too, are of great interest. Here is the original manuscript copy of the Jerusalem Liberata, published at Ferrara in 1581, and in Tasso's own handwriting, the first 4 folio editions of Shakespeare, once the property of that great actor and Shakespearean student, John Philip Kemble, a folio of designs for Elizabethan and Jacobean houses by the celebrated architect John Thorpe, Fauntleroy the forger's illustrated copy of Pennant's London, purchased for 650 guineas, a commentary on Paul's epistles, illuminated by the laborious Croatian Giulio Clovio, who died in 1578, for Cardinal Grimani. Vasari raves about the minute finish of this painter. The pictures, too, are good. There are 3 Canalettis full of that Dutch Venetian's clear common sense. The finest, a view on the Grand Canal, his favourite subject, and The Snake in the Grass, better known as Love Unloosing the Zone of Beauty, by Reynolds. There is a sadly faded replica of this in the Winter Palace at St. Petersburg. This one was purchased at the Marchioness of Thomond's sale for £500. The Rake's Progress by Hogarth, in 8 pictures, was purchased by Sir John in 1802 for £598. These inimitable pictures are incomparable, and display the fine, pure, sober colour of the great artist, and his broad touch, so like that of Jan Steen. The Soane collection also boasts of Hogarth's 4 election pictures, purchased at Garrick's sale for £1,732 and 10 shillings. They are rather dark in tone. There is also a fine but curious Turner, Van Tromp's barge entering the Texel, a portrait by Goma of Napoleon in 1797, when emaciated and haggard, and a fine miniature of him in 1814, when fat and already on the decline, both physically and mentally, by Isabey, the great miniature painter, taken at Elba in 1814. In the dining room is a portrait of Soane by Sir Thomas Lawrence, and in the gallery under the dome a bust of him by Chantrey. Sir John Soane was the son of a humble Reading bricklayer, and brought up in Mr. Dance's office. Carrying off a gold and silver medal at the Academy, he was sent as travelling student to Rome. In 1791 he obtained a government employment. In 1800 enlarged the Bank of England, and in 1806 became Professor of Architecture at the Royal Academy. He built the Dulwich Gallery, and in 1826 the Masonic Hall in Great Queen Street. In 1827 he gave £1,000 to the Duke of York's monument. At the close of his life he left his collection of works of art, valued at £50,000, to the nation, and died in 1837, leaving his son penniless. In 1835 the English architects presented Sir John with a splendid medal in token of their approbation of his conduct and talents. The Literary Fund Society, instituted in 1790 and incorporated in 1818, had formerly rooms at No. 4 Lincoln's Inn Fields. The society was established in order to aid authors of merit and good character, who might be reduced to poverty by unavoidable circumstances, or be deprived of the power of exertion by enfeebled faculties or old age. George IV. And William IV. Both contributed 100 guineas a year to its funds, and this subscription is continued by our present Queen. The Society distributed £1,407 in 1846. The average annual amount of subscriptions and donations is about £1,100. The Literary Fund Society moved afterwards to 73 Great Russell Street. Some years ago a split occurred in this society. Charles Dickens and Mr. C. W. Dilke, the proprietor of the Athenaeum, objecting to the wasteful expense of the management, seceded from it. The result of this secession was the founding of the Guild of Literature, and the collection of £4,000 by means of private theatricals, a sum which, unfortunately, still lies partly dormant. The fund is now domiciled in Bloomsbury. Both Pepys and Evelyn praise the house of Mr. Povey in Lincoln's Inn Fields as a prodigy of elegant comfort and ingenuity. The marquetry floors, the perspective picture in the little closet, the grotto cellars, with a well for the wine, the fountains and imitation porphyry vases, his pictures, and the bath at the top of the house, seem to have been the abstract of all luxurious ease. Names were first put on doors in London in 1760, some years before the street signs were removed. In 1764 houses were first numbered. The numbering commenced in New Burlington Street, and Lincoln's Inn Fields was the second place numbered. In Carey Street lived that excellent woman, Mrs. Hester Chapone, who afterwards removed to Arundel Street. She was a friend of Mrs. Carter, who translated Epictetus, and of Mrs. Montague, the Queen of the Blue Stockings. She was one of the female admirers who thronged round Richardson the novelist, and she married a young Templar, whom he had introduced to her. It was a love match, and she had the misfortune of losing him in less than 10 months after their marriage. Her celebrated letters on The Improvement of the Mind, published in 1773, were written for a favourite niece, who married a Westminster clergyman and died in childbed. Though Mrs. Chapone's letters are now rather dry and old-fashioned, reminding us of the backboards of a too punctilious age, they contain some sensible and well-expressed thoughts. Here is a sound passage. Those ladies who pique themselves on the particular excellence of neatness are very apt to forget that the decent order of the house should be designed to promote the convenience and pleasure of those who are to be in it, and that if it is converted into a cause of trouble and constraint, their husbands' guests would be happier without it. Gibbon's tennis court stood in Vere Street, Clare Market. It was turned into a theatre by Thomas Killigrew. Ogilby the poet started a lottery of books at the old theatre in June 1668. He describes the books in his advertisements as all of his own designment and composure. The Duke's Theatre stood in Portugal Street, at the back of Portugal Row. It was pulled down in 1835 to make room for the enlargement of the Museum of the College of Surgeons. Before that, it had been the china warehouse of Messrs. Spode and Copeland. There had been, however, frailer things than china in the house in Pepys's time. Here, the year of the Restoration, came Killigrew with the actors from the Red Bull, Clerkenwell, and took the name of the King's Company. 3 years later they moved to Drury Lane. Davenant's company then came to Portugal Street in 1662, deserting their theatre, once a granary, in Salisbury Court. They played here till 1671, when they returned to their old theatre, then renovated under the management of Charles Davenant and the celebrated Betterton, the great tragedian. They afterwards united in Drury Lane, and again fell apart. In 1695, a company, headed by Betterton, with Congreve for a partner, reopened the theatre in Lincoln's Inn Fields. It then became celebrated for pantomimes under Rich, the excellent Harlequin. On his removal to Covent Garden it was deserted, reopened by Gifford from Goodman's Fields, and finally ceased to be a theatre about 1737, so that its whole life did not extend to more than one generation. Actresses first appeared in London in Prynne's time. Soon after the Restoration, a lady of Killigrew's company took the part of Desdemona. In January 1661, Pepys saw women on the stage at the Cockpit Theatre. The play was Beaumont and Fletcher's Beggar's Bush. The prologue to Othello in 1660 contains the following line: "Our women are defective and so sized, you'd think they were some of the guard disguised, for, to speak truth, men act that are between 40 and 50 wenches of 15, with bones so large and nerves so uncompliant, that when you call Desdemona, enter giant." The Puritans were now happily in the minority, and so the attempt succeeded. Davenant did not bring forward his actresses till June 1661, when he produced his Siege of Rhodes. Kynaston, Hart, Burt, and Clun, famous actors of Charles II's time, were all excellent representatives of female characters. It was at the Duke's Theatre in 1680 that Nell Gwynn was present, being reviled by one of the audience, and William Herbert, who had married a sister of one of the king's mistresses, taking up Nell's quarrel, a sword fight took place between the two factions in the house. This hot-blooded young gallant Herbert grew up to be Earl of Pembroke and first plenipotentiary at Ryswick. The chief ladies at the Duke's house were Mrs. Davenport, Mrs. Davies, and Mrs. Saunderson. The first of these ladies, generally known as Roxalana, from a character of that name in the Siege of Rhodes, resisted for a long time the addresses of Aubrey de Vere, the last Earl of Oxford, a wicked, brawling roisterer and a disgrace to his name, who at last obtained her hand by the cruel deception of a sham marriage. The pretended priest was a trumpeter, the witness a kettle drummer in the king's regiment. The poor creature threw herself in vain at the king's feet and demanded justice, but gradually grew more composed upon an annuity of 1,000 crowns a year. As for Mrs. Davies, who danced well and played ill, she won the susceptible heart of Charles II by her singing the song, "My lodging is on the cold, cold ground." Through the marriage of the daughter of Lord Derwentwater with the 8th Lord Petre, says Dr. Doran, the blood of the Stuarts and of Moll Davies still runs in their lineal descendant, the present and 12th Lord. Mrs. Saunderson became the excellent wife of the great actor Betterton. For about 30 years she played the chief female characters, especially in Shakespeare's plays, with great success. She taught Queen Anne and her sister Mary elocution, and after her husband's death received a pension of £500 a year from her royal pupil. In 1664 Pepys went to Portugal Street to see that clever but impudent impostor, the German princess, appear after her acquittal at the Old Bailey for inveigling a young citizen into a marriage, acting her own character in a comedy immortalizing her exploit. In February 1666-7, Pepys goes again to the Duke's Playhouse, and observes there Rochester the wit and Mrs. Stuart, afterwards Duchess of Richmond, the same lady whose portrait we retain as Britannia on the old halfpennies. "It was pleasant," says the tuft-hunting gossip, "to see how everybody rose up when my Lord John Butler, the Duke of Ormond's son, came into the pit towards the end of the play, who was a servant to Mrs. Mallet, and now smiled upon her, and she on him." The same month, 1667-8, Pepys revisits the Duke House to see Etheridge's new play, She Would If She Could. He was there by 2 o'clock, and yet already 1,000 people had been refused at the pit. The fussy public office man, not being able to find his wife, who was there, got into an 18-penny box, and could hardly see or hear. The play done, it being dark and rainy, Pepys stays in the pit looking for his wife, and waiting for the weather to clear up, and there for an hour and a half sat also the Duke of Buckingham, Sedley, and Etheridge, talking, all abusing the play as silly, dull, and insipid, except the author, who complained of the actors for not knowing their parts. In May 1668 Pepys is again at this theatre in the balcony box, where sit the shameless Lady Castlemaine and her ladies and women. On another occasion he sits below the same group, and sees the proud lady look like fire when Moll Davies ogles the king, her lover. In another place he observes how full the pit is, though the seats are 2 shillings and 6pence apiece, whereas in his youth he had never gone higher than 12pence or 18pence. Kynaston, the greatest of the boy actresses, was chiefly on this stage from 1659 to 1699. Evadne was his favourite female part. Later in life he took to heroic characters. Cibber says of him, "He had something of a formal gravity in his mien, which was attributed to the stately step he had been so early confined to." But even that in characters of superiority had its proper graces. It misbecame him not in the part of Leon in Fletcher's Ruler Wife, which he executed with a determined manliness and honest authority. He had a piercing eye, and in characters of heroic life a quick, imperious vivacity in his tone of voice that painted the tyrant truly terrible. There were 2 plays of Dryden in which he shone with uncommon lustre. In Aurungzebe he played Morat, and in Don Sebastian Muley Moloch. In both these parts he had a fierce lion-like majesty in his port and utterance that gave the spectator a kind of trembling admiration. Kynaston died in 1712, and left a fortune to his son, a mercer in Covent Garden, whose son became rector of Aldgate. James Noakes was Kynaston's contemporary in Portugal Street. Leigh Hunt calls him something between Liston and Munden. Dryden mentions him, in a political epistle to Southerne, as indispensable to a play. Cibber says, "The ridiculous solemnity of his features was enough to have set the whole bench of bishops into a titter. In his ludicrous distresses he sank into such piteous pusillanimity that one almost pitied him. When he debated any matter by himself, he would shut up his mouth with a dumb, studious pout, and roll his full eye into a vacant amazement." He died in 1692, leaving a fortune and an estate near Barnet. But the great star of Portugal Street was Betterton, the Garrick of his age. His most admired part was Hamlet, but Steele especially dilates on his Othello. He acted his Hamlet from traditions handed down by Davenant of Taylor, whom Shakespeare himself is said to have instructed. Cibber says that there was such enchantment in his voice alone that no one cared for the sense of the words, and he adds, "I never heard a line in tragedy come from Betterton wherein my judgment, my ear, and my imagination were not fully satisfied." This great man, who created no fewer than 130 characters, was a friend of Dryden, Pope, and Tillotson. Kneller's portrait of him is at Knowle. A copy of it by Pope is preserved in Lord Mansfield's gallery at Caen Wood. When he died, in 1710, Steele wrote a Tatler upon him, in which he says, "He laboured incessantly and lived irreproachably. He was the jewel of the English stage. He killed himself by driving back the gout in order to perform on his benefit night, and his widow went mad from grief." Betterton acted as Colonel Jolly in Coleman's Cutter of Coleman Street, as Jaffier in Otway's Chef d'Oeuvre, as fine gentleman in Congreve's vicious but gay comedies, as a hero in Rowe's flatulent plays, and as Sir John Brute in Vanbragh's great comedy. Mrs. Barry was one of the best actresses in Portugal Street. She was the daughter of an old Cavalier colonel, and was instructed for the stage by Rochester, whose mistress she became. Dryden pronounced her the best actress he had ever seen. Her face and colour varied with each passion, whether heroic or tender. Her mien and motion, says Cibber, were superb and gracefully majestic, her voice full, clear, and strong. In scenes of anger, defiance, or resentment, while she was impetuous and terrible, she poured out the sentiment with an enchanting harmony. She was so versatile that she played Lady Brute as well as Zara or Belvidera. For her, King James II originated the custom of actors' benefits. After a career of 38 years on the boards, she died at Acton in 1713. Kneller's picture represents her with beautiful eyes, fine hair drawn back from her forehead, the face full, fair, and rippling with intellect, but her mouth a little awry. Mrs. Mountfort also appeared in Portugal Street before the two companies united at Drury Lane in 1682. She was the best of male coxcombs, stage coquettes, and country dowdies, a vivacious mimic, and of the most versatile humour. Cibber sketches her admirably as Melantha in Marriage à la Mode. She is a fluttering, finished impertinent, with a whole artillery of airs, eyes, and motions. When the gallant recommended by her father brings his letter of introduction, down goes her dainty diving body to the ground, as if she were sinking under the conscious load of her own attractions. Then she launches into a flood of fine language and compliment, still playing her chest forward in 50 falls, and rising like a swan upon waving water. And to complete her impertinence, she is so rapidly fond of her own wit that she will not give her lover leave to praise it, and at last she swims from him with a promise to return in a twinkling. The virtuous, good, and discreet Mrs. Bracegirdle was another favourite in Portugal Street. For her, Congreve, who affected to be her lover, wrote his Araminta and Cynthia, his Angelica, his Almeria, and his Millamant in The Way of the World. All the town was in love with her youth, cheerful gaiety, musical voice, the happy graces of her manner, her dark eyes, brown hair, and expressive rosy brown face. Her statira justified Nat Lee's frantic Alexander for all his rant, and, when she acted Millamant, all the faults, follies, and affectation of that agreeable tyrant were venially melted down into so many charms and attractions of a conscious beauty. Mrs. Bracegirdle was on the stage from 1680 to 1707. She lived long enough to warn Cibber against envy of Garrick, and died in 1748. 3 of Congreve's plays, Love for Love, The Mourning Bride, and The Way of the World, came out in Portugal Street. Steele, in the Tatler, No. 1, mentions Love for Love as being acted for Betterton's benefit, Mrs. Barry, Mrs. Bracegirdle, and Doggett taking parts. He describes the stage as covered with gentlemen and ladies, so that when the curtain was drawn, it discovered even there a very splendid audience. In Dryden's time, says Steele, you used to see songs, epigrams, and satires in the hands of every person you met at the theatre. Now you have only a pack of cards, and instead of the cavils about the turn of the expression, the elegance of style, and the like, the learned now dispute only about the truth of the game. Poor Mountfort, the most handsome, graceful, and ardent of stage lovers, the most admirable of courtly fops, and the best dancer and singer of the day, strutted his little hour in Portugal Street till run through the body by Lord Mohun's infamous boon companion. His career extended from 1682 to 1695. He was only 33 when he died. The last proprietor of the theatre was Rich, an actor who, failing in tragedy, turned harlequin and manager, and became celebrated for producing spectacles, ballets, and pantomimes. Under the name of Lunn, he revelled as harlequin, and was admirable in a scene where he was hatched from an egg. Pope, always sore about theatrical matters, describes this manager's pompousness in the Dunciad, Book 3. At ease, mid storm of paper, fierce hail of peas, and proud his mistress order to perform, rides in the whirlwind, and directs the storm. Rich's great success was the production of Gay's Beggar's Opera in 1727–8. This piece brought £2,000 to the author, and for a time drove the Italian opera into the shade. It ran 63 nights the first season, and then spread to all the great towns in Great Britain. Ladies carried about the favourite songs engraved on their fan mounts, and they were also printed on fire screens and other furniture. Miss Lavinia Fenton, who acted Polly, became the idol of the town. Engravings of her were sold by thousands. Her life was written, and collections were made of her jests. Eventually she married the Duke of Bolton. Sir Robert Walpole laughed at the satire against himself, and "Gay grew rich, and rich gay," as the popular epigram went. Hogarth drew the chief scene, with Walker as Macheath and Spiller as Mat o' the Mint. Swift was vexed to find his Gulliver for the time forgotten. The custom of allowing young men of fashion to have chairs upon the stage was an intolerable nuisance to the actors before Garrick. In 1721 it led to a desperate riot at the Lincoln's Inn Fields Theatre. Half a dozen beaux, headed by a tipsy earl, were gathered round the wings, when the earl reeled across the stage, where Macbeth and his lady were then acting, to speak to a boon companion at the opposite side. Rich, the manager, vexed at the interruption, forbade the earl the house, upon which the earl struck Rich, and Rich the earl. Half a dozen swords at once sprang out, and decreed that Rich must die. But Quin and his brother actors rushed to the rescue with bare blades, charged the coxcombs, and drove them through the stage door into the kennel. The beaux, returning to the front, rushed into the boxes, broke the sconces, slashed the hangings, and threatened to burn the house. Upon which doughty Quin and a party of constables and watchmen flung themselves on the rioters and haled them to prison. The actors, intimidated, refused to reopen the house till the king granted them a guard of soldiers, a custom that has not long been discontinued. It was not till 1780 that the habit of admitting the vulgar, noisy, and turbulent footman gratis was abandoned. Macklin, afterwards the inimitable Shylock and Sir Pertinax, played small parts at Lincoln's Inn Fields Theatre till 1731, when a short speech as Brazencourt in Fielding's Coffee-house Politicians betrayed the true actor. He lived till over 100, so long that he did not leave Covent Garden till after Braham's appearance, and Braham many of our elder readers have seen. Macklin, an Irishman, and in early life a dragoon officer, was irritable, restless, and pugnacious. He obtained his first triumph at Drury Lane as Shylock in 1741. In stern malignity no one has surpassed Macklin. His acting was hard, but manly and weighty, though his features were rather rigid. He naturally condemned Garrick's action and gesture as superabundant. His Sir Pertinax was excellent in its sly and deadly suppleness. He was also admirable in Lovegold, Scrub, Peacham, Polonius, and many Irish characters. Quin was at Portugal Street as early as 1718-19. There he first delighted the town by his chivalry as Hotspur, his bluntness as Clytus, his fieriness as Bajazet, his grandeur as Macbeth, his calm dignity as Brutus, his unctuousness as Falstaff, his duplicity as Maskwell, and his coarse drollery as John Brute. It was just before this that, locked in a room and compelled to fight, he had killed Bowen, who was jealous of his acting as Bajazet. When Rich refused to give Quin more than £300 a year, he joined the Drury Lane Company, where he instantly got £500 per annum. When Rich grew wealthy enough to hire a new theatre in Covent Garden, he left Portugal Street. Almost the last play acted there was The Anatomist by Ravenscroft, a second-rate author of Dryden's time. The mob attributed the flight of Rich from the old theatre to the appearance of a devil during the performance of the pantomime of Harlequin and Dr. Faustus, a play in which demons abound. The supernumerary spirit ascending by the roof instead of leaving by the door with his paid companions was believed to have so frightened Manager Rich that, taking the warning against theatrical profanity to heart, he never had the courage to open the theatre again. The legend is curious, as it proves that even in 1732 the old Puritan horror of theatricals had not quite died out, and at that period the poorer part of the audience was still ignorant enough to attribute mechanical trips to supernatural interference. Garrick, in one of his prologues, speaks of Rich under the name of Lun. When Lun appeared with matchless art and whim, he gave the power of speech to every limb, though masked and mute conveyed his quick intent, and told in frolic gestures all he meant. But now the motley coat and sword of wood require a tongue to make them understood. Every motion of Rich meant something. His statue scene and Catching the Butterfly were moving pictures. His Harlequin hatched from an egg by sun heat is highly spoken of. Jackson calls it a masterpiece of dumb show. From the first chipping of the egg, his receiving of motion, his feeling the ground, his standing upright, to his quick harlequin trip round the broken egg, every limb had its tongue. Walpole says, "His pantomimes were full of wit, and coherent, and carried on a story." Yet Rich was so ignorant that he called a turban a turbot, and an adjective an adjutant. Spiller, who died of apoplexy in Portugal Street in 1729-30, as he was playing in The Rape of Proserpine, was inimitable in old men. This was the year that Quin played Macheath for his benefit, and Fielding brought out his inimitable Tom Thumb at the Haymarket to ridicule the bombast of Thomson and Young. King's College Hospital, which occupies a large portion of the southern end of Carey Street, is connected with the Medical School of King's College, and is supported by voluntary contributions. For each guinea a year, a subscriber may recommend 1 in and 2 outpatients. Contributors acquire the same right for every donation of 10 guineas. Annual subscribers of 3 guineas, or donors of 30 guineas, are governors of the hospital. The house is surrounded by a population of nearly 400,000 persons, of whom about 20,000 annually receive relief. In 1 year, 363 poor married women have been attended in confinements at their own houses. The last memorial of a gay generation, passed like last year's swallows, was a headstone that used to stand in the burial ground belonging to St. Clement's, now the site of King's College Hospital. The slab rose from rank green grass that was sprinkled with dead cats, worn-out shoes, and fragments of tramps' bonnets. In summer it was half hid by a clump of sunflowers. It kept dimly alive the memory of Joe Miller, a taciturn actor, in whose mouth Motley, the poet, put his volume of jokes that had been raked from every corner of the town. Motley was a place-seeker, and a writer of stilted tragedies and a bad comedy, for whose benefit night Queen Caroline, wife of George II, condescended to sell tickets at her own drawing-room. Miller appears to have been an honest and stupid fellow, but some good sayings are embalmed in the rather coarse book which bears his name. His portrait represents Joe as a broad-nosed man, with large saucer eyes, a big absurd mouth, and a look of comic, stolid surprise. He died in 1738, and the jest book was published the year after, price 1 shilling. Joe Miller made his first appearance on the stage in 1715 at Drury Lane in Farquhar's comedy of A Trip to the Jubilee. He also played Clodpole in Betterton's Amorous Widow, Sir H. Gubbin in Steele's Tender Husband, La Fool in Ben Jonson's Epicene, and above all Sir Joseph Whittall in Congreve's Old Bachelor. Hogarth designed a benefit ticket for this play. As Ben, in Love for Love, Cibber cut out Joe Miller. In 1721 Joe opened a booth at Bartholomew Fair with Pinkerthman. His last great success was as the Miller in Dodsley's farce of The King and the Miller of Mansfield. Stephen Duck, the Wiltshire thresher, afterwards a popular preacher, wrote his epitaph. Joe Miller's monument is still carefully preserved in one of the rooms in King's College Hospital. John Motley, his editor, was the son of a Colonel Motley, a Jacobite who followed James into France. His son was placed in the excise office and grew up a place hunter. He wrote a bad tragedy called The Imperial Captives, and was promised a commissionership of wine licenses by Lord Halifax and a place in the Exchequer by Sir Robert Walpole, but received nothing from either. He compiled the jest book, it is said partly from the recollection of the comedian's conversations, but it is doubtful if this is true. The compilation, once so useful to diners out, went through 3 editions in 1739, and at about the 13th edition was reprinted, after 30 years, by Barker of Russell Street, Covent Garden. The Grange public house close by, with its picturesque old courtyard, is mentioned by Davenant in his Playhouse to Let as an inn patronised by poets and actors. The Black Jack public house in Portsmouth Street was Joe Miller's favourite haunt. Some paintings on its walls still testify to the occasional presence of artists of the last century. This inn used to be called The Jump, from that adroit young scoundrel Jack Sheppard having once jumped from one of its first-floor windows to escape the armed emissaries of that still greater thief, the thief-taker, Mr. Jonathan Wild. When paviors dig deep under the Strand, they find the fossil remains of antediluvian monsters. A church in the street bears a name that carries us back to the times of the Saxons and the Danes. In one lane there is a Roman bath. In another there are the nodding gable ends of houses at which Beaumont and Fletcher may have looked, and which Shakespeare and Ben Jonson must have visited. So the present is built out of the past. The Strand teems with associations of every period of history. The story of St. Giles's parish alone should embrace the whole records of London vagrancy. The chronicle of Lincoln's Inn Fields embraces reminiscences of half our great lawyers. In the chapter on St. Martin's Lane, I have been glad to note down some interesting incidents in the careers of many of our greatest painters. Longacre leads us to Dryden, Cromwell, Wilson, and Stothard. At Charing Cross we have stopped to see how brave men can die for a good cause. A thorough history of our great city, considered in every aspect, would almost be a condensed history of the world. I offer these pages to my readers only as a humble contribution to the history of London. Our commercial wealth and the vastness of our maritime enterprise is shown in nothing more than by the distance from which we fetch our commonest articles of consumption: tea from China, sugar from the West Indies, coffee from Ceylon, oil from the farthest nooks of Italy, chocolate from Mexico. An Englishman need not be very rich in order to consume samples of all these productions of different hemispheres at a single meal. In the same manner, many books of far divided ages have gone to form the patchwork of the present volume. I am like the merchant who sends his ships to collect in different harbours, and across wide and adverse seas, the materials that he needs. In this busy and overworked age, there are many persons who have no time themselves to make such voyages, no patience to traverse such seas, even if they possessed the charts. It is for them I have written, and it is from them I hope for some kind approval. End of chapter 26, part 3. End of Haunted London by Walter Thornbury.